Okay, we're gonna get started here. We'll get started here in a minute. Okay, we got a lot to talk about on this stream, so we're going to try to get through the news articles, and then we're going to do a deep dive. I've sort of tried to change the format, so we're going to talk about 4 major topics. Good evening, RK and Kevin. Yeah, the 580. We're going to talk about that because that's just something that just randomly popped up in my news feed. So I just kind of thought we'll throw that out at the very beginning here. But there's 4 things, so just to kind of show the agenda here. We're going to do the tech news first, then we're going to talk about FSR 3, because there's like so many videos about FSR 3 by now. And then we're going to talk about AMD's fluid motion frames, and then we're going to talk about Intel's 14th gen launch, which is coming out within, it's a little under 2 weeks to go for the Intel 14th generation. So the Raptor Lake refresh is on the way, just for those that are curious. So that'll be the last thing we talk about. And depending on how quick we get through the tech news, we'll be able to get into some of the more interesting things. So going back here. So the first news article is the Intel Arc A580 actually might be real. I really thought this was canceled because everybody kept saying Intel Arc is being canceled. I knew it wasn't canceled, but like the product itself, the Arc lineup, I knew it wasn't canceled, but I wasn't sure if the 580 was actually going to become a reality, because if you look at Intel's product stack, there's essentially the 380 at the bottom, you have the A750 in the middle, and you have the A770 up at the top. So it's kind of odd that now there's a 4th GPU, supposedly. Sid's asking, and will you cover? Yeah, well, there's no real info about them right now. There's a little bit. Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the motherboards. RX 580 loses support and A580 comes in to replace it. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the 580 hasn't lost support yet, but I think, yeah, it's moving in that direction. So just 2 weeks ago, an ongoing delay in Intel's launch of the Arc A580. I really thought that the A580 is most likely going to be in pre-builds. I don't really see this graphics card being sold too heavily in the consumer, like the PC DIY build it yourself market. Because if you look here, so there's the 3, the 5, and the 7. And within the 7, there's 2 of them, which is kind of strange. And then when you look at from the 3 to the 5, so from the A380 to the A580, that's a massive jump in the number of XE cores. You're talking about like 3 times the ray tracing units, and it's just a massive jump from the 380 to the 580. So it almost raises the question of, why does the A750 need to exist? Because if you look at the 580, and the 750, they're actually really close. The difference is the A750 has 4 more Xe cores, 4 more ray tracing units, and quite a few more XMX engines, and it's faster. But it has the same amount of memory, it has the same memory bus, or no, not the same memory bus, it has the same memory bandwidth. So, kind of a strange choice there. Micro Center exclusive. I don't think it says Micro Center exclusive. It doesn't mention that, no. No, I think it will be sold like all over the place. I just don't know why it's launching now. It just seems really late for this. Well, it's not launching now. It just says that well, it says it should it launch. See, they don't know if it'll actually launch. I mean, it realistically it is going to be a thing because there's already leaks of the ASRock and the Sparkle. So, it's going to exist. It's just nobody really knows when. And it was never mentioned at Intel Innovation Week. So, I don't know when this thing's going to show up. But it's just something, it's interesting because it's like if you can't get an A750, this might be more affordable, slightly, but I can't see this thing costing significantly less because it's not that much weaker than the A750, at least theoretically, looking at the specs. You think it will be close to 15% slower, maybe 20% because of clock speed? I don't think 20% can be made from 300 megahertz. A 300 megahertz increase is like a 5%, 3 to 5% change in performance if we're talking about the same exact chip. So, no, this is slightly small. This will probably be like more like 10, maybe 10% slower. I don't think this is going to be that much slower. So, if anything, it could be replacing the A750 because I feel like the A750 doesn't really sell that much, like compared to the A770. So the A380 and the A770 probably sell a lot more than the A750. So I guess if they discontinue the A750 and replace it with the A580, then the 580 should be cheaper to produce because it has less hardware. Although the A750 realistically is probably just defective A770s that are salvaged to work as an A750. So who knows? Like, I don't really know. But it's interesting that it's been almost a year since the ARC A7 series, so the 770 and the 750. They launched almost a year ago. It was October, what was it, like October 12 or something? So literally almost a year ago. And a year later, we get the A580. Really strange. Hey, Matt. Yeah, XMX engines are the tensor cores. Yeah. So, okay, so it has a lot less XMX engines, but I mean, still, that's not really going to change the GPU performance that much overall. So, yeah, I don't know. I think this is just going to be a cheaper A750. It has the same amount of memory also. That's why I can't see this thing. I can't see this thing going for more than like, well, because it's $250 for an A750. Intel will probably charge $200 for this thing. This will probably be $200, $199. I expect the ARC A580 to be about $200. Anywhere from like 180 to 220, 219. Anywhere from like 179 to 219, I think, is where this thing will be priced at, in that range. So basically around $200, give or take. That's where I think this will be. Which is, like we were kind of joking earlier, like the 580. The AMD 580 is going to retire, and the Intel one is just going to take up the mantle and just keep going. Quite literally. It's like the 580 number just never seems to go away. There was the AM. There was the well. I mean, if you go further back, there was an Nvidia one too. There was a GTX 580. So first there was a GTX 580. That was like 2011. Then there was the RX. Well, there was the 480. There was GTX 480 in 2010, GTX 580 2011. Then there was the AMD Radeon RX 480 in 2016. Then there was the 580 in 2017, and now there's the Intel Arc 580, in 2023. Assuming it comes out this year, like it might actually come out next year, or it might never come out ever. And somebody just found some old marketing slides from Intel or something, and they just put this picture up on video cards. I don't know how to say video cards. Video card Z. Is this videocardz.com or video cards or video cards? I don't know how to pronounce this website's name. Like the website has a weird name. Video cards Z or video cards Z or video cards or just video cards, like plural. But that's not actually the correct way of spelling that. So really weird website name. I know a lot of people in my Discord use video cards Z, whatever this is, like to reference a lot of news articles. I personally don't really use video cards that much unless there's like some GPU launch that's coming out soon, and this website typically has info. Otherwise, I don't really look at video cards that much. So, whatever. Anyway, so that's the Intel A580. Are you guys planning to get one of these? Does anybody want to get one of these? Like, is this something that people are actually looking for? I guess that should be the question that we're asking. Like, should this thing actually exist? It's like, think about how bad, well, I don't want to say bad, but how lackluster the GPU launches of 2023 have been thus far. Like, literally, there was only 2 good ones. Like, if you had to pick, the only 2 decent ones, well, there was the 7800 XT was good, and then there was the 4070. So a lot of people like to bash on the 4070, especially now, because the 4070 just looks like really bad value compared to the rest of NVIDIA's product stack, let alone how it compares to the new 7800 XT. But, like, if I had to pick one GPU from NVIDIA that launched this year that I could say it passed in terms of an okay product launch, I would probably have to give it to the RTX 4070. I think the 4070 is the only one that is somewhat tolerable. You know what I mean? Like, it's $600 and it has 12 gigabytes of VRAM. So it's, finally it's over that 8 gigabyte limit that it was so hard for NVIDIA to take that step into that swimming pool, of more VRAM. But they finally got there with the 4070 at a price point that is somewhat digestible, so to speak. $600 is a lot of money. It's $100 more than the PlayStation 5, which is literally an entire console. For $500, whereas this thing is just a graphics card for $600. So, but anyway, I think that's probably NVIDIA's best launch of the year. And then for AMD, obviously the 7800 XT, probably the best GPU launch of the entire year. And then for Intel, I guess, congratulations, Intel, you put a GPU out there too, just like everybody else. Now there's the 8, well, I mean, it hasn't launched officially, but assuming it comes out this year, between now and the end of December, they basically have an entire quarter to get this thing out the door if it's going to be a reality. So Kevin's not getting one. I've been thinking of getting a 380, but I am not going to get one anymore because there's a problem with Intel's drive. Like, I don't even know if it's Intel or Windows. So there's an issue with Intel when you install an Arc GPU as a second GPU. There is some insane, like, latency spike or something that happens occasionally. Because today I was trying to test Forspoken with FSR 3. So I tried to test it on, did I test it on Intel? No, I didn't test, did I test? No. Did I test it on Intel? So what I did was I installed the RX 7900 XT as the primary GPU. Then I installed the A750, so not the A770, but the A750 as the second GPU. And I had to do a driver install for that because this was being installed into a Threadripper system. And there was some kind of messed up latency. Like, you go into Forspoken and there's some crazy lag that I don't know what was going on. Like, you would click to go into settings, and it would look like the game was non-responsive or frozen. But then eventually, after like 9 seconds, it would come back, and then it would bring up the menu. Then you'd click on something, and it'd be okay for like a few clicks, and then it would like freeze again for another 8-9 seconds. Then it would come back. And I'm thinking, like, what's going on here? So the only thing that fixed it was remove the Intel GPU. I was running the game off of the AMD GPU, but with the Intel GPU as a secondary GPU, you try to do like an Alt-Tab or something, there's some crazy lag. Like, I don't even know why. So then I took out the Intel GPU. I put in an NVIDIA GTX 1080 in there because I wanted to test FSR 3 with an old GTX 1080. Well, here's the thing that happens if you plug in an old NVIDIA 10 series GPU. So, interestingly enough, you get FSR 3. You get the ability to run FSR 3, native AA, and the different, basically what was like the FSR 2 presets. You get quality, performance, ultra performance, whatever. You get all that stuff. You balance all the presets that were in FSR2. You get all of that for the GTX 1080. Now, what you do not get is frame generation. So the FSR3 menu is there, but the sub-menu for frame gen is not there with the GTX 1080. So that's the reason why they said in the press release, and even in the release notes, it's like, it's not recommended to run this on GPUs other than, and then they list the ones that they recommend, which is basically RDNA 2. Actually, no. I think minimum was RDNA 1, 2, and 3. And then for GeForce, it was RTX 20, 30, and above. So basically, if you're on anything that's GTX, you miss out on frame generation because it doesn't actually work. And it's nothing to do with AMD. It's just because the GeForce driver, I guess, like the game itself, Forspoken, and I guess Immortals of Avium is the same way. Although I don't have that game, so I can't test it. But the hooks are not there. Like, the game developers turn it on, but it's like it's almost like there's an if and an else if statement. It's like if GPU equal to RTX or equal to RX. Whatever, then frame gen enable, equal true, that kind of stuff is going on. Because it's like, if GPU equal to GTX, like frame gen equal false. So, stuff like that. So, basically, the flag is not enabled for the old GTX. So, you don't get that if you're on Pascal, which is kind of sad for the people that are still on 1080 Ti and 1060, because there's a ton of people that still have those graphics cards. And, there's all those memes about, like the Nick Tech video, about, like, FSR 3, what do you think about FSR 3? Because it's going to allow GeForce, Pascal, and all the old boys, to be able to play the game on higher frame rates, even though they're synthetic frames. And it's like, well, nope, you can't do it, because it's like the game developer didn't turn it on. So I guess they forgot to, or they didn't test it, so they don't want to deal with people complaining and saying the game is trash because it can't run on their ancient GTX 970 with frame generation. So there you go. That is what I discovered when it comes to trying to turn on FSR 3 for a old NVIDIA graphics card, like pre-RTX. So a raise here. So anyway, so that's going to be it for the discussion on the A580. Let's see, what else did I want to go through here on video cards? So there's a new Somehow is this official or is this leaked? Somebody reported that AMD will unveil its high-end RDNA 3 mobile GPU very soon. I don't know what they mean by very soon, but okay, good. Well, actually, hold on. This is actually a Navi 31. So they're putting a Navi 31 GPU in a mobile device? Man, somebody needs to make, like, Asus or somebody, or Lenovo. They not only do they need to make those big, heavy gaming laptops with this stuff, somebody needs to make a really big, thick, like, Ally, like an ROG Ally 2, or a Lenovo Legion 2 Pro, whatever, like, handheld. Like, if this thing was in a handheld, this would be, like, the best handheld ever. Although it would need a really fat battery, so maybe people wouldn't like that because it would be pretty heavy, but it's still gonna be really small. So I don't know. That'd be pretty good. That would make for a really nice handheld, really nice gaming laptop too, man. 72 compute units. Why couldn't the 7800 XT have 70 compute units? No, I'm not even asking for 72. Why couldn't it have 70 compute units? This is really weird because it's like AMD has all these different cut down variants of Navi 31. You guys notice that? There's like a 70, there's a 80, there's a 90, what is it, 84, and a 96, and then now there's a 72. This is basically what isn't this like what the 6800 XT was? Oh, that was already 2? Something like that. This lends credibility to the rumors about a smaller. Yeah, there is. Okay. Well, okay, this is dumb. This writing is so, like, this shows me whoever wrote this article, they literally don't pay attention to the products that exist in the market. Because this lends credibility to the rumors about a smaller Navi 31. Do these people not know, like, that the W7800 exists? Am I the only one that has mentioned that newsflash, there's a W7800 Enterprise Professional Workstation card, and it has 70 compute units, and it's been around since March? So, yeah, okay. Well, apparently they're just going to ignore the Enterprise card, because it's basically the same thing. Same exact die, just different driver set. So anyway, so that's going to be this. So that's cool. You know, if you like gaming laptops, this is an interesting article. They would have needed to use cut down Navi 31 for 70 CUs since the full Navi dies. Well, yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. Like, why is the 7800 XT not the 70 compute unit? You see what I'm saying? Like, I said this before. The 60 compute unit should be the 7700 XT. At least in my mind. The reason why I'm saying that, and now I'm going to sound like a broken record to the people who have been hearing me say this in multiple live streams, but if we remember, there is a GPU called the Radeon Pro W7800. It has 4480 cores, 256-bit bus. It is Navi 31, and it has 70 compute units, and they decided to name it the 7800. So this is why when I saw and this thing launched April 13th of this year. So I'm guessing that they want to sell these cards, which not a lot of people buy, because not a lot of people buy the AMD Radeon Pro compared to the regular Radeons. So I don't know, they're reserving these for the professional market for some reason. But now we learn that there's another chip, a 72 compute unit, that they want to put in mobile devices. That is even more bizarre, considering when you think about AMD's products, like if you think about AMD's GPUs, AMD's discrete GPUs, I'm not talking about the APUs, so forget about the APUs, Forget about the integrated graphics in the Ryzen 7000 series. Think only about the Radeon GPUs. AMD sells most of their discrete GPUs to the consumer market, not the professionals, which is this stuff. And they don't sell that many mobile chips. I don't think AMD Radeon, like in laptops, sells nearly as much as the actual discrete GPUs. Now, I could be completely wrong and have no idea what I'm talking about because, a lot of people, for some reason, think gaming laptops are cool, but or they buy them for other things, like they think they can use a gaming laptop as a workstation laptop. I've seen people do that. Like if anybody watched the legal proceedings on like Trump in the courthouse, there was a picture. I didn't really watch it, but I saw like a picture from Twitter or somewhere, or like on a recommended news article. And literally, one of his attorneys, he had two lawyers. He had a male lawyer and he had a female lawyer, and I think there was a third one. But the male lawyer sitting to the left of Trump had an Asus ROG laptop on the desk. You know how I could tell? Because it had that Asus ROG logo with all the big RGB flashing. Oh, like that's not distracting to the jury and the judge. Like that's hilarious. Asus with their RGB is literally sitting right next to Trump in the courthouse. So I'm thinking, okay, well, that attorney is using a gaming laptop for business, for basically his job. So that's what I mean when I say people can buy gaming laptops and use them for work and not really for gaming. So, and it's because the gaming laptops typically, it's a safe bet because gaming laptops come with a lot of like high-end hardware. They typically have the higher-end mobile CPUs, not the U series. They usually have the H series. And then they also have, the big GPUs like the 7900M and the 6800M and the NVIDIA RTX 3080 laptop, or Max Q or whatever. So I could be wrong. Maybe AMD sells way more mobile parts than I'm aware of in the GPU market, and it's justifiable to put a 70 compute in professional and a 72 compute in mobile and not in desktop. But anyway, whatever. It's going to be power limited anyway, so it's not like the 7900M is going to outperform a 7800 XT. It'll probably get close. If I had to guess, it'll probably perform like a 7700 XT or something like that. Who knows? Or maybe somewhere between that and a 7800 XT. So anyway, so that's going to be this for those that are interested in mobile. And the last video card article is Threadripper 7000 to launch 1.5 years after the 5000 series. So I think everybody already knew this. We talked about this before. They're claiming that it's going to launch on October 19th. That is very close to Intel's 14th gen. Like, that's going to be kind of weird. Like, okay, I thought this was going to launch in December, but apparently, or around, like, November, like Thanksgiving. But apparently they're going to launch it now. It's like, nope, we'll launch it now. Let's do what Intel did. Back when 4090 was launching, Intel decided to launch Arc on the same exact day as the 4090 because they thought that was a good idea. We're going to get a lot of publicity if we launch on the same exact day as the 4090. That's a good idea. So basically, AMD's doing something similar because I think 14th gen launches like 2 days before this. So they're both launching the same week, if this is true. So I don't know where they got this. It says this information comes from WCCF Tech. Maybe you had the exact same article open. So, TRX50 chipset. See, the problem is this thing, you see the words 96 cores, you know that this thing is going to cost a lot of money. So this thing it's basically going to be thrown out into the market to downplay the 14th generation, I guess. But it's not like the people that are going to buy 14th generation are going to buy this instead, because this thing is going to come with sticker shock. Like, this thing's literally going to have sticker shock. You look at it, and you're going to go blind because of how expensive it is. So, yeah, it's cool. Don't get me wrong. This thing is going to basically shred everything known to man in the PC space for a while at least. It's going to sit on the top as king of the hill. Because what's going to happen, here's what's going to happen. If this launches on October 19th, all the reviewers that are going to be given, they probably already have them, they're going to be given this thing, the Intel 14th gen packaging of the Core i5, i7, i9, or maybe they're only going to be given the i7 and the i9. Who knows? Whatever. Maybe all three of them. Although I really think that reviewers might not be given the 13 or the 13, the 4. It's because they're so similar. The 14600K, because the 14600K is probably not going to be that. It's not going to be that interesting. It's basically the same as a 13600K. 6 plus 8, nothing changes. It might get a little bit like a 200 megahertz bump on the turbo, and that might be about it. So not a whole lot there to talk about. That leaves the 14700K, which is probably going to be the most interesting one, because that's the only SKU that's actually going to be different. And then there's going to be the i9, but the i9 is going to be nothing more than a 13900KS rebranded as a 14900K. So there might be some tweaks to the memory controller. I'm hoping for some tweaks to the memory controller because I'm very not impressed. Let's just put it this way. I am not impressed with Intel's memory controller when it comes to trying to run a lot of memory. They don't do well with 4 sticks of memory, and they don't do well with dual rank 4 sticks of memory, especially dual rank. And I had to reinstall Windows because the 13900K corrupted my operating system because the memory was unstable, and it didn't flat out tell me until 2 days later. And yeah, so not too happy about that. So hopefully the 14th gen has an improved memory controller, especially if you want to run 4 sticks of memory, because if it doesn't, then to me it's a complete skip. Like complete skip. It's basically 13 with another number on there. Same exact thing, especially if you're on the i9 or the i5. Now, the i7 is the only one that's different because the i7, do I even have a story about this? Apparently I don't even have a story about this. Hold on. Do we have one here? Tim Cook owns more than $500 million? Let's see. This is the newest article. The 14700K is the only one that is going to be different because it's going to get a whooping 4 more E-cores. So it has 12 E-cores. So that's different. So that further differentiates it from the previous i7, and that further differentiates it from the i5. And the i7 has always been Intel's most iconic CPU from a branding statement. Like if you tell somebody, I got an i5, they're like, oh, only an i5? Only an i5? Okay, cool story, bro. Cool, okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, that's really worth mentioning. So you don't like to tell people you got an i5 because it's like, I got an i5. An i5? What? Why? Why do you have an i5? Like, who wants that? You know what I'm saying? So the i7 is the one that always seems to be the sophisticated, the smart, the savvy person's Intel CPU. Because if you tell people you have an i5, they think that you are kind of a loser. And if you tell people you have an i9, they're going to think that you're either an Intel fanboy or you're someone who just should not deserve the job that you have because you clearly don't know how to deal with money, right? Like if you're buying why are you buying an i9? Because it's so expensive, Why are you going to waste all that money on an i9? Because it gives you a bunch of useless E-cores. You're not getting any more P-cores, So that's the reason why the i7 is the smart buyer's choice because it's in the middle. It has the same amount of P-cores as the i9, It doesn't have all the bloatware, wasted silicon, aka a bunch of E-cores that you don't actually need. They don't actually do anything, so it's like, especially if you're Windows 10. So you're like, oh, you tell someone like, oh, I have a 13th gen and I'm using Windows 10. You're like, what? Like, this is a way to contradict, like, it makes people question your authority, like, in technology. Like, what? You're using a 13th gen with an i9 with Windows 10? Like, what? See, so anyway, I mean, I'm speaking from experience because I have the 13900K with Windows 10. And the E-cores are kind of useless. They get parked most of the time. And then it looks kind of dumb if you turn them off, because you turn all 16 of them off. It's like, okay, now you just have a 8-core 16 thread. So now you have a $550 i9 that only has the same amount of cores as a 7800X3D or a 7700X, and those CPUs cost way like $200 less. See, so that's the reason why. The conclusion here is the i7 is the only one to pay attention to. The other, you might as well pretend that the other two don't even exist. Because realistically, the i7 14700 is the only one that makes sense. If you're going to get an i5, you're better off buying a discounted 13600K instead of a 14600K, because that's a big waste of money. And then the i9, same deal. You're literally throwing money in the trash to have the number 14 on the badge or in CPU-Z instead of the 13900K, which is probably going to get discounted further once this thing comes out. So, I mean, looking at the price here, they're even talking about markups in terms of the price. So 14900K is 3% more. I mean, it's not terrible. Like, the i7 is the one that's going up the most, about 4% increase in price. But that kind of makes sense because it's the only one that's interesting and it's the only one that's actually different. So that's all I have to say on that. We'll talk more about this later on in the stream. We're going to talk about the chipset stuff and kind of my hopes and dreams for what this can actually do when it launches in a few weeks. So, but let's move on now. So I guess the other thing I wanted to talk about was, don't want to talk about Call of Duty. So Call of Duty could get better with Microsoft, says Activision president. Present and future settings work best. What's present and future settings? What does that mean? Shouldn't it be like high settings or something? What is future settings? I don't know what this article is talking about. It's just something that I thought was kind of worth mentioning briefly. So, as we previously, this deal, blah, blah, blah. Okay. I'm not someone who plays Call of Duty that much anymore. So, anyone who plays Call of Duty is going to have to comment on this. But, I don't know what they mean by present and future settings work best. I don't know what that means. But anyway, Activision's president says Call of Duty is better with Microsoft. I don't know what that means, but that's basically what they're hinting at. Let's see. Okay, in other news, Asus rolls out AMD Agisa 10080 BIOS for AM5 motherboards. This supports upcoming Ryzen 7000 Phoenix APUs. Okay, so this is basically adding support for the APUs. So there is a bunch of CPU stuff coming out this fall. So it looks like we're getting APUs for Ryzen. We're getting Intel's 14th generation desktop, and Intel recently launched Meteor Lake, although I don't know what exactly besides mobile is that going to go to. And then the other thing is Threadripper Pro. So Threadripper Pro is finally coming out, and no one's going to be able to afford it. So, but it's going to look really good in the benchmarks. There's that. You play COD every night, you don't know what it means either? Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea. Yeah. They talk about World War II game. The original World War II game from Sledgehammer in 2017 did really, really well. I don't even know what they're talking about. Because wasn't it Which Call of Duty was World War II? Because there was COD 4? Isn't it like the original Modern Warfare? No. No, that's not World War II. Wasn't it COD 4? I don't even remember. It's so long ago. I haven't paid attention to Call of Duty since like the first Black Ops and like the first Modern Warfare 2. Like after Modern Warfare 2, then I just kind of forgot about the entire franchise. So, you know, like, and I'm not talking about the remaster. I'm talking about the one from like 2011 or 10 or whenever that game came out. I don't even remember. It was somewhere around there, if I had to guess. So it's been a long time. Let's see. Have we... oh, okay. Here's one more thing about Intel's Arc, and then we're going to start talking about FSR 3. So Intel Arc Game On drivers bring Forza Motorsport and Assassin's Creed Mirage. Oh, for those that don't know, Assassin's Creed Mirage is a new game that came out this week. DX11, DX12 titles get up to 2x performance boost. So they're claiming 2x performance increase on certain games. So just to show some of these numbers, they're claiming that Call of Duty Black Ops 3 under DX11, 1080p high, is getting 80 up to 88% performance uplift. I don't know what that actually means though, because every time I've tested Intel's GPU after they've done some major driver where they claim all these massive improvements, I really don't notice the improvements. I test the thing and it's like there's nothing to report. It's basically the exact same thing as before. You know, like maybe the minimum is better, or maybe the 1% low went up significantly, so it's not a micro stutter fest. But you know, like it's still averaging roughly the same FPS. So I don't know where they're getting these numbers. Where are they testing the game that they're seeing like an 88% uplift? Like 88% uplift from what? Because it's like, you know how crazy that sounds? If we go to A770. They're saying 88% uplift. That literally means that the Intel GPU performs like a 6900 XT in Call of Duty with the new driver, or like a 7800 XT. They went from being wherever they were at in that game to 88% improvement. So what that means, they're now like a 7800 XT. I don't get it, because I really don't believe that. To me, that sounds like fake news. That's just straight up fake news. I don't even know where they're getting these numbers. Because I tested the Arc, it didn't seem like it was like this. So I don't know. And like Deus Ex Human Revolution, for like the 4 people that are playing that right now, they're claiming 119% increase. 119% increase? I don't even know what to say. Something would have to have been seriously broken. Exactly. And this one got 119% uplift. So what I want to know is, where is The Last of Us? Okay, see, here's a game that Intel's GPU does like 30 frames per second. And they got a 12% increase. Meanwhile, they're claiming like 88% in Call of Duty in Black Ops 3. They were probably already running like 70, 80 FPS in that game. And they're doing like 88% better in a game where they're already above 60. Meanwhile, here's a game where they only do 30 FPS and they got a 12% increase. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Like that's just weird. Naraka got a 5% increase. You know, like whatever. I don't know. Anyway. Okay. So now let's move on to a different thing. You tested Black Ops 3 and you did not see that performance uplift? Yeah. I haven't tested it on this latest driver. I tested the A750 and I didn't really notice any differences at all. Now I did notice that there was a firmware update. Like you said, I remember you mentioned there was a firmware update. And so here's the thing, like, it seemed really sketchy to install that firmware update because this is the CPU that I was using. I had Threadripper. This was the Threadripper TR2950X was the CPU. I had this as a CPU, and in the primary GPU slot, I did this earlier today, and I was thinking I might brick something. I had RX 7900 XT right here. The monitors were connected. So the monitors were connected to this GPU. Then down here, I had A750 installed. I had the A750 installed as the second GPU in this computer. So when I went to install Intel's driver, it basically, it was warning me saying, okay, there's a firmware update included in this driver. Click continue to proceed. And it's like, okay, next. And then it says, there's a warning message saying, it basically said close all open applications, including, it specifically stated something like, including video playback applications. So that means any browser, like you can't have any YouTube thing open or Twitch thing open. And basically any kind of media player needs to be closed out, and anything that's going to use a GPU for hardware acceleration. So that could be, OBS, that could be DaVinci Resolve, any sort of media player, like VLC, all that stuff need to be closed down and not open while doing this firmware update. But I was thinking, though, the Intel GPU isn't actually doing anything. It's not being used to drive the monitors because the AMD card was doing everything. So I thought, it did tell me in the warning screen, it said monitor flickering may be observed. This is normal. Do not attempt to restart the PC during this process. So I was thinking, okay, well, I don't think I'm going to witness any of these problems, or not problems, I should say, but any of these sort of observations because I'm using the Radeon card as the primary. So I click proceed, and it ends up doing everything fine, but it took a long time to do it for that firmware update in particular, and it never gave me any indication of how far it was. Like, there was no loading bar telling me, like, the progress of the firmware update to the graphics card. Nor did it ever tell me what the previous version firmware was and the new firmware was. It didn't tell me a before and after, so I had no idea what was the current firmware. I had no idea what was this new firmware that it was trying to install or flash on the cards, VBIOS. So I was like, it's not very confidence-inspiring. Let's put it that way. Intel's installation process for that was definitely, I don't want to say sketchy. It's just like, it makes you, it's anxiety-inducing. Let's put it that way. It raises your anxiety level because you don't know, especially in this scenario where there's another GPU installed, which is not an Intel GPU, and thankfully it's not on an Intel motherboard, because sometimes there's stupid things with the chipset, because Intel's driver tool, for some reason, it likes to recommend, like, it kept telling me that, do you want to update your Bluetooth driver? I'm like, no, why would I want to update my Threadripper motherboard's Bluetooth driver? Like, why? No. So I'm like, please stop telling me what I need to update, because, this is not an Intel motherboard. So that was kind of annoying. Anyway, I eventually took the graphics card out after it was updated because it was causing me all kinds of weird latency issues while trying to test FSR 3 on the AMD card. So what I ended up doing was I removed it, and then I proceeded to install GTX 1080 down here, and this didn't cause the weird, like, lagging input latency spikes while testing FSR 3. But then the other problem with the 1080 is when I swung the monitor cables over to the 1080 and stopped using the 7900 XT, the problem that I ran into is FSR 3 works, but there's no frame generation toggle. So that's just something to note. Anyway, also you made the choice to Sapphire. Oh, you made the switch. Wait, what? Oh, you chose the Nitro Plus XTX versus the Tai Chi for aesthetic purposes. Finally, okay. You wondering if I undervolt the Nitro? No, I'm not undervolting the GPU at all right now. Just if you're gonna undervolt, try. I would only do like. I would drop it down. Like if it's 1150, for example, I would do 1050. Try it to see if it's stable at that. Because when I undervolted the 7800 XT for the overclock, oh, if you want it to run at a lower power limit, then switch the BIOS. Use the other BIOS. Because the Nitro has multiple BIOSes. You can switch it over to the BIOS that's 355, and then it won't do that. So that's actually how I'm running mine. So mine's in the... they don't call it the silent BIOS, but it's the other BIOS. It's the middle one. You switch it over to the middle one because there's 3 positions. The Sapphire Nitro comes with... there's the left BIOS, which I think is the default. There's the middle BIOS, and there's the right BIOS. So this one is the default. The default one, the power limit is like 435 watts or something. Somewhere around there. The middle one is 355 watts. And this one is... This one, I don't know what this one is. I think this one is actually the software controlled one. The one over here, I think, is also 435 or something like that. How much performance loss do you get from switching? But you don't really get much performance loss. I mean, the only reason why you would run it like that is if you're trying to do overclocking records. Otherwise, what I would do is I run it on this one. I switch it over to the middle. Like, that's literally how I've been using mine since March of this year. So, actually, yeah, pretty much. You only really need to use this BIOS if you're trying to do, like, a overclocking record or something. Otherwise, just set it to the middle one, and that's all you gotta do. Yeah, the thing is, the 355 watt is the reference spec. So, all the voltages, all the, like, target clock speed, everything, the memory preset, all that stuff is basically the same as the reference card. Now, the difference is it's still going to outperform the reference card because the big cooler results in lower operating temperature, so you get more boosting headroom with the Nitro versus the reference card. Whereas the reference card maxes out pretty quick, and you're also power limited, so you can't really do anything there in terms of like tweaking it, besides trying to overclock it with like a mild undervolt, which is basically what I did for the 7800 XT. So yeah, so meaning you can use the middle BIOS and still get better performance if you try to overclock it. So with that power limit. So, but I mean, you know, if you do the 435 watt, it's still going to be better, like in terms of the actual numbers. But, you know, the thing is, this GPU, like if you're at 1440p, just use the middle one and just forget about it. Because 1440p, this card for 1440p is kind of overkill. So, and I remember, I'm gaming at 4K. I don't game at 1440p. I game at 4K, and I'm using the middle one. So that's what I'd recommend. And it's good enough as is. It'll be interesting to see if you can fit a capture card with the carbon. Yeah, you will. The carbon is exactly the same as the master, I think, in terms of the spacing. So, X670E carbon Wi-Fi. Yeah, this one's exactly the same. Let me go to the gallery. Yes, you can fit a... Wait, actually, hold on a second. No, I take that back. It's different. This actually sits lower than I thought. So this is 1, 2, wait a minute. 1, 2, 3. It's going to be very close. Because you're probably... So the thing is, the capture card... Actually, how is this thing wired? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, no, you're good. You're good. You know why? Because MSI was smart. MSI was so smart the way they did this. Yes, you plug in the third slot. Yeah, I was going to say, like, the bottom slot is an X4, and that's the magic slot. That's where you'll plug in the 4K capture card. Like the AVerMedia Live Gamer 4K, that would go right there in the bottom. You wouldn't use the second one because the second one shares lanes with the GPU. So as soon as you plug something in there, your GPU only runs at X8. So, which is, it's not terrible. It's not like you're going to lose a lot of performance by doing that, but it's just kind of feels bad to know that your GPU is only running at half of the lanes. So, yeah, the card will go... I'll tell you, like, the card will literally almost be covering the... It'll almost cover the second slot, but I don't think it will actually cover it. Meaning, if you really had to, you could plug something in there, but it would be so close to the fan that you're basically starving that rear fan and maybe the middle one from air if you do that, because it's so close. Like, I'm gonna guess that when you put that thing in there, it's gonna almost cover the slot, but you would technically be able to fit something there. It would just be really, really close. So that's my guess, because with the Aorus Master, because this is what I have with the card, and I can tell you, like with this, see with this, they put 3 slots in between the first and the second PCIe. So there's literally 1, 2, 3, and then you count the slot itself, that's 4. So the Gigabyte Aorus Master did 4 slots total, including the top one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, which means the second PCIe slot is in the 5th slot, and the bottom one is the 6th slot. So if we go to MSI, MSI is... The top is actually where the second M.2 goes, and that's the problem. Because what MSI should have done is they should have put this M.2 should be in the place where the slot is, and the slot should be exchanged. That's the difference. See, the Master has one M.2 between the CPU and the GPU, then it has 3 M.2s all right next to each other in a row, and then it has the second and third PCIe slot. I really think that Gigabyte nailed it with the layout. Like, I really like the way the Aorus Master has everything laid out. Because the M.2s are right next to each other. There's literally 3 of them in a row. And then, you know, you can fit a 4-slot GPU in here without any issue. So, but what MSI did is they did one M.2 up here with its own heatsink. Then they did another one with its own heatsink. Then they did the GPU, and there's 2 more M.2s right next to each other. See, that's the problem. They put, yeah, yeah. Because the problem is, even with this, the thing that people will always be worried about with this layout is massive air coolers. But the thing is, even though Gigabyte put the top slot like closer to the CPU, I can still fit a massive Noctua NHD 15 right here without any issue in terms of the GPU. Like, the GPU can fit there just fine. The Noctua comes close to it, but it's not touching it at all. And then I can also use the giant heatsink for the M.2 drive without any problem. And the Aorus Master has that really nice button over here on the right, so I can just click the button if I need to quick disconnect the GPU. I don't need to, you know, use a like a hard drive sled rail or a screwdriver or something to press down on the tab to release the graphics card, because the air cooler basically is covering it up. So that's really nice that it has that button there. So yeah, this motherboard, yeah, the Aorus Master. There's a reason why when I graded all these motherboards, there's a reason why this one is S tier, because you can tell that they really thought of almost every sort of scenario where, like, if you have a giant air cooler, how do you get the GPU out? Is there going to be enough spacing between the air cooler and the GPU? There's no problems. If you have a 4-slot GPU, can you still use the second and third slot without any issues? Yes, you can. So, and then of course, M.2 cooling. So it has a really good heatsink for the Gen 5 slot. And I'm using that with the Crucial T700 right now. Like, I'm literally using the fastest SSD in the world right there in the top slot there for the M.2 drive. And there's no problem with overheating or nothing. So there's enough metal, there's enough flow. Also, the Noctua air cooler provides some auxiliary airflow over the SSD heatsink, as well as the backplate of the GPU. And that's one of the benefits of those large air coolers that you do not get when you have a radiator or an AIO. So that's why I'm a big fan of the big air coolers. I don't have to worry about leaks. I don't have to worry about the pump failing. I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. It's all air. It all works. The AMD CPU doesn't use that much power, so it's never really a problem. So, it's easy. You'll see how it goes if it covers the second slot. Yeah, I think it will come really close, but I don't think it's going to actually cover it. I think it's going to be so close, though, that if you plug something in, the GPU, the fan is going to be like right up against, almost touching the whatever is going to go in there, like the capture card or whatever. So, yeah, overall, I think the MSI board is okay. Like, it's got 8, 9. It's got 8. It's got 8 USB A, and then it has a 20. It has a USB-C with display out, so you can actually run 3 monitors off of the integrated graphics. I like that it has the smart button and the BIOS flashback. Or no, not the BIOS flashback. It has the clear CMOS. So, I mean, it's got everything that's needed, really. Like, yeah. It's kind of like the Master, except the Master's larger because it's an eATX. This is a standard ATX. And other than that layout, I really think Gigabyte was the smartest one. Like, they were looking into the future when they designed this motherboard. They're like, I predict that all the GPUs within the next few years are going to be really thick cinder blocks, 4 slots wide. So we need to, use this kind of layout. Very smart. Okay, so anyway, let's get rid of all this stuff. So I've been trying to figure out, like, what's a good way to do a video on FSR 3 and maybe DLSS 3 now that I have the ability to test both, because I didn't have the ability to test both. Well, I mean, FSR 3 only came out, like almost a week ago at this point. But now that it's out, now that it's available to a lot more platforms, it's not really, because when DLSS 3 came out, we talked about that. We talked about frame generation. In fact, I think a month ago, I kind of really did a deep dive into DLSS 3 and how it actually worked. Not so much the, technical aspects of it, but, the actual effect that you get on the screen. With the actual synthetic frames. But FSR 3 works, so it effectively achieves the same goal, but it does it in a different way. So, let's discuss kind of the different upscaling, or let's talk about the different generations of FSR. FSR 1. First was FSR 1. And this thing was spatial upscaling. So spatial upscaling is actually not really that new. Yeah, it's paint time. So spatial upscaling is something that has been used in the professional world for, like, for example, if you're going to remaster an old film, or you're going to remaster a movie that was made in the the 70s or the 80s. Like, think of the original Star Wars films, like the original trilogy, episode 4, 5, and 6. I think the first one was like 1977 or something, and then the second one was like 1980, and then 1983. I don't really know if I have those dates correct, but regardless, those movies were made in a long time ago, when the transition from analog to digital was only beginning to take off. 1977 was that the first Star Wars movie? So yeah, then I think the second one would have been 1980 and then 1983, because I think they're always spaced 3 years apart. So spatial upscaling has been a thing that has existed for a long time. So FSR 1 uses spatial upscaling. So it can take let's say, a resolution of, say, 720p, which is roughly 1 million pixels, and it can turn this into an image, like an output image, that is, say, 1080p, which has, this is roughly 2 million pixels. So when you think about the difference between 720p and 1080p, you're talking about doubling the pixels. So a game, in order for a GPU to run a game at 1080p versus 720p, it literally needs to be able to deal with twice the number of pixels. So this is the reason why, when we think about graphics cards 10 years ago, so that would have been, 2013, 1080p was really the target resolution that most hardware engineers building GPUs, and also game designers, game developers, they were targeting a 1080p resolution as the final output resolution for their image. So they were working with 2 million pixel, roughly speaking, 2 million pixel canvas, so to speak, in terms of where they would render the game to the viewport, which would ultimately be on the display. And this is the reason why, when you think about GPUs from 10 years ago, like, what was the most powerful GPU in 2013? In this time, 10 years ago, it would have been a mix between the R9 290X, and very soon it would have been the GTX 780 Ti, or alternatively, the original Titan. So the original Titan, the R9 290X, and the GTX 780 Ti were the three most powerful GPUs. Now, the 780 Ti and the 290X, 780 Ti had 3 gigabytes of VRAM. So it had 3 gigabytes of VRAM to handle 1080p gaming. Now, the 290X had 4 gigabytes of VRAM. So it had 1 gigabyte more, so it was a little bit more future-proof. And then the Titan, of course, which people largely ignored because it was $1,000, had 6 gigabytes of video memory. So it had double the amount of the consumer GPU, because back then the Titan was kind of it was marketed as a prosumer graphics card. It was a GeForce graphics card, but you didn't really, you could use it for gaming, but no one really did. It was largely ignored. And think of that as what the 4090 or the 4090 is today. So you fast forward to around now. I don't know, why is this like this? Why is the... So if we talk about 4K, 4K is roughly 8.3 million pixels. So that's a lot. That's like 4 times the number of pixels of 1080p. Hence the name 4K. It's 4 times 1080p. So that is a significant jump. In fact, when you guys think about the transition from the 720p era, which I really don't know, the 720p era is really weird because that was the time when, if you were doing PC gaming, there was the old like 1024 by 768 monitors, like the big CRTs. Then there was this strange like 1280 by 1024, like a 5:4 aspect ratio, which was not really, it was more of a square than it was a rectangle. And then they started doing widescreen. So then there was the 1280 by 720, the 1366 by 768. That was a very popular resolution, especially on laptops. Then there was the 1600 by 900, the 1680 by 1050. I was a big fan of 1680 by 1050 because that was like the golden ratio, the 16 by 10 aspect ratio. So I was a big fan of that one. And then that was there for a while. Then they finally introduced they call it Full HD, which was 1080p, so 1920 by 1080. But then there was also the 16 by 10 version of that, which was 1920 by 1200. Now, 1920 by 1200 or 1600 by 1200, I think that was the more square one. And then there was of course, the 1080p resolution. These resolutions became the new like high-end resolutions. So once graphics cards were powerful enough to run Crysis, one of the reasons why Crysis stayed as a meme for so long, the whole can it run Crysis, but can it run Crysis? It was because there was this transition from 720 to 1080. Now all of a sudden, when you had Crysis on 1080, all of a sudden it was so hard to run Crysis again. So this doubling of the pixels is what raised the bar in terms of requiring better hardware to deal with this doubling of the pixels. So it's interesting to mention all this because when you think about what we have today with upscaling, there wasn't really any sort of approach or solution to tackle the challenge of achieving playable frame rates at 1080p resolution the way there is this massive effort to introduce upscaling to handle 4K target resolutions. Because I really think that the reason why spatial upscaling exists is because the resolution has gone up such that the amount of hardware required to achieve a 4K gaming experience, and when I say 4K, I'm talking about 60 frames per second. The amount of hardware required to do 4K 60 or better at a, let's say a high preset or a very high preset or even an ultra preset in a typical game made on a modern engine. So that could be UE5, that could be UE4, that could be Frostbite, whatever, Square Enix's multiple things, Elden Ring, whatever. All the stuff, like the Starfield, Skyrim engine, whatever. A modern engine, in order to achieve playable frame rates at 4K resolution, this is not financially viable for the average consumer, nor is it financially viable for the average hardware vendor. So, thus, the age of upscaling was born. Psycho is saying, I remember gaming at 1200p, 85 hertz on the sun. Yeah, I remember. Those monitors were really good. I remember seeing somebody playing WoW Someone was playing World of Warcraft on one of those monitors. I think it was like my older cousin or somebody, one of my friends. Somebody had a 1200, like a CRT 1200i monitor. Or was it 1200i or 1200p? No, I think, aren't those all interlaced? I can't remember. Aren't CRTs interlaced? I think they are. Anyway, yeah. That was like, it looked crisp. It didn't run good. It was too hard to run. Because I think whatever they were running it on, it was not, like the GPU was not powerful enough to handle WoW. Plus, WoW was very CPU heavy back in the day. You know, because it was like DX9 and it was single threaded. And I mean, I ran WoW on a single core AMD 64 back in the day. But anyway, you know, now we're getting sidetracked. But anyway, the point is, back then, the jump from 720p to 1080p took, let's think about how many generations of hardware that actually took. Because it wasn't really until, I would say it wasn't really until the GTX 970. The GTX 970 from NVIDIA in 2014 was the point at which 1080p gaming was, for the most part, affordable. So let's go ahead and state that here. So the challenge of 1080p 60 gaming was solved by the GTX 970 and I guess whatever the AMD one was at the time, like the R9 290 or 390, something like those GPUs. Like, these GPUs made 1080p gaming mostly, they made it a lot more accessible to a wider audience. Why? Because these GPUs were not that much money. The MSRP of the GTX 970 was $329. Most of them, all the AIBs, the average price was around $349. So realistic pricing was about $350. You know, so this was mostly affordable for 1080p 60 gaming back in 2014. So about 9 years ago. And that's where I feel like 1080p was finally solved. Like, because when you think about what it was like to play games at 1080p or 1200p at 60 FPS on ultra settings, prior to Maxwell and prior to AMD's Hawaii GPUs, it was much harder to do. The GTX 480 cooked itself alive to basically try to hit 60 in most titles. The AMD 7970 gigahertz edition came really close and was almost able to solve the problem. But the problem was there were too many games that would come out like shortly after that GPU came out that then made that GPU already look obsolete. And it was the same with NVIDIA, because NVIDIA launched GTX 680 to counter the AMD 7970, and then both of them end up getting beaten by, you know, like some single-threaded game, aka Guild Wars 2, you know, and you can't even really run it, and it was so CPU-bound, so it didn't really run good. It wasn't really until NVIDIA moved to a multi-threaded software-based scheduler in their driver for DX11 that the 1080p era was fully accessible to the vast majority of people, I would say. The 4090 is a 1080p GPU on Cyberpunk with over... Well, okay. Ray tracing is another thing, though. Like, ray tracing brings a whole nother aspect. And so we're not really going to focus too much on ray tracing in this discussion. We're going to focus on upscaling, because I think there's a lot of motivation as to why upscaling exists, at least behind the scenes. Like, outside of the public's view. When it comes to running your games at playable frame rates, because of this big push to 4K, you need to leverage upscaling. That's just how it is. Because, like I said earlier, the cost to run 4K 60 native is very cost prohibitive to the average consumer. And like I said, not only is it too expensive for most people, it is largely too expensive for the vendor, the hardware manufacturer. And who am I talking about when I'm talking about the hardware vendor? I'm talking about Sony and Microsoft, and to a lesser extent, Nintendo. Because these are still the hardware vendors that hold on to this market. Now, outside of them, I will also mention Apple, because mobile gaming is actually a thing, believe it or not. Android phones as well. So all the different Samsung phones, that's why Samsung have been partnering with AMD to try to put Radeon in their phones and their mobile devices. Now, they're slowly trying to distance themselves from that, and they're trying to do Exynos with mobility, GPU acceleration, but we'll see how that goes. So there's a big demand for 4K gaming in the hardware vendor market, but the problem is it's just so hard to do. It's so hard. Who would have thought, that it's really hard to drive 8.3 million pixels on the screen at 60 frames per second with high fidelity visuals and a lot of post-processing effects. Who would have? Oh, I wonder why that's so hard to do. It's 4 times the number of pixels as 1080p, but I wonder why it's so hard to do. Well, it turns out it's just a lot of pixels. It's a lot of pixels, and it's consuming a lot of electricity. So if you try to do this on a mobile device, it's going to destroy the battery. It's going to eat the battery because you got to run the thing up so high. You got to run the clock speed so fast to be able to even do it. So we're not there yet. 4K is still really, really hard to handle for the vast majority of devices. Now, a lot of people always want to quickly default to the most powerful GPUs, the most expensive stuff. Well, the reality is the vast majority of the market is not going to be considering an XTX or a 4080, let alone a 4090, though that's even worse in terms of the price. So you got to try to figure out, well, how do you do 4K at an affordable price with, acceptable costs for the hardware to build and manufacture with the yield count, and also be able to sell it to consumers at a reasonable price that they can afford? Well, it turns out $500 is kind of the upper end of that price. Maybe $600, maybe $600. So that kind of limits you to something along the lines of a 7800 XT and an RTX 4070. Anything above those are basically out. They're just disqualified because they're just too expensive. Even though they have either a mixture of VRAM and whatever technologies and a lot of shaders, etc. They have a lot of hardware to throw at the problem, and it's like a consumer can spend a lot of money to throw at a problem. Who would have thought you can take a lot of money and toss it at a problem, and it can kind of go away? That's basically what a 4090 does. That's what an XTX can kind of do for the most part, and to a lesser extent, the 4080 can also do that. It's just kind of less hardware overall, less memory. So. But anything else? No. So this is the reason why upscaling is kind of the answer to this problem. So first there was spatial upscaling. The ability to take an input image, so like an image of either the game's background, the foreground, the background, etc. Everything except the UI, and upscale that spatially using a technique that I think a lot of people, unless you're somebody who works in video editing, you're probably not going to be familiar with this, but we're about to talk about the underlying technology behind FSR1 and how it works. So it uses a mathematical function, it turns out. And if you're someone who has ever tried to use a program called OBS for either recording gameplay or recording something on your desktop or if you're trying to stream video, for example. OBS will reveal these settings, but the way FSR works is it uses a kind of filter, which is essentially a sync function, but it is called the Lanczos. I used to pronounce it as Lankos, because I think that sounds better, but Lanczos or Lanczos is essentially the name. So Lanczos is the underlying secret function. I say secret, but it's not really a secret. It's essentially a sync function that is used to spatially upscale a given image. So it works by filtering kind of the pixels in terms of you have a fixed number of pixels. Like let's say you look at like a 4x4, you take a group of 4 pixels or 8 pixels or whatever, right? You look for patterns in terms of color, the output color range, and you try to figure out where there are changes in color, so that when you tone map on the next frame or on your output frame, I guess in this case we're going to upscale from say 720 to 1080 or 1080 to 4K or 1440 to 4K, whatever it is. You take your source image and you look at where the colors match and where the colors differ within like neighboring pixels. So what that means is if I have, say, let's say I've got, well, let me just draw it out. Let's say I have pixels that are right next to each other here in a grid. Now I know these are not drawn to scale, but imagine if they're all the same size. So let's say we got 5. Let's say we got a 5. What is this? Do I want to do 5x5? Yeah, let's do 5x5. So imagine if this is all, I'm just going to say this is like a 5x5 cube, right? So somewhere in here, I guess I shouldn't draw that like that. But if I have, let's just say I have a 5x5. Now I shouldn't have done 5x5 because this is too big for me to draw. It's going to look really messy. But the point is, I think you guys will understand. If I have a sample section of the image, there's going to be a point in the image or a region within the group of pixels that the colors will differ. So I might have, say, blue pixels here. The top row might be all blue pixels. And then I might have blue pixels like here, here, and here. And I might have one down here. But then somewhere in there, I might have a different color. Let's say I've got orange. Let's say I've got orange pixels here. Okay, and then everything else here is like orange. Let's just to keep things simple, let's just use 2 colors. So what ends up happening is within this sample of a 5x5 grid of pixels, the algorithm can say, okay, you know, there is kind of a pattern here where these pixels are kind of on a boundary, like, no, not that one, but you know, these are touching, they're adjacent to pixels that have different color ranges within them. So it tries to kind of fit this together in the upscaled image so that you don't get weird artifacts in color due to negative color values or colors that just don't match. When you blow the picture up to a higher resolution, because we're upscaling, it tries to reduce the like errors in color, which could result in artifacts, ringing, etc., in terms of like over sharpened looking output or shimmering as you're moving the camera around. These are the sort of limitations with the Lanczos function, because it's not really designed to do these sort of things. So what AMD had to do for FSR is they had to introduce additional features such as color clamping. So what that means is, like I just said, if we have a region within the image where adjacent pixels have different colors, we're going to apply kind of a lock, so to speak, where the colors won't change for the next frame, or I guess the upscaled frame, I should say, because we're not talking about FSR 3 yet. But the upscaled frame, I want, because when you upscale, you're going to have more pixels than you started with. So you kind of have to set a lock in areas where the colors differ in terms of the boundary. Otherwise, you'll end up getting this weird... You'll see effects where, like as you move the camera, if you're looking at like a lamppost or like a phone line or something, that wire in the scene will kind of fade in and out real fast as you're panning the camera around. That's because this sort of thing is there. There's a difference in the color. The color might be the blue sky versus the phone line, in the background, where that skinny little wire of phone line is vanishing and appearing and vanishing and reappearing as you pan the camera around because of this effect. Because when it's upscaled, the color data in the newer pixels that are added, because now we're going from a 5x5 grid to something like a 15x15 grid or a 30x30 grid, or whatever the output resolution ends up being. So you have to introduce things like color clamping or locking pixels so that they maintain the same color in the same position of the overall image and that sort of thing. So there's more to it than just using a Langzos filter. So basic Langzos versus FSR1, there's a noticeable difference in terms of the output. The Langzos one will tend to look shimmery, or either in some cases it could be over sharpened, especially as you move the camera around, whereas FSR1 will end up looking softer. And that's why I think FSR1 got the reputation for being kind of blurry, so to speak, because it's softer, because they're doing like color clamping and the locking the position of some pixels so they don't really move, they don't change in terms of the color, but then they introduce too much softness, so it might look blurry, kind of like DLSS 1 when that first came out. So those look like the size of pixels on a 1080p 32-inch monitor. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. But it was an interesting solution because it was relatively easy to do. You didn't need any specialized hardware to do this, because as long as your hardware could run, or I guess even the software, could run the Langzos function, you could get upscaling by doing this. I really have a feeling that some earlier versions of spatial upscaling were based off of this. Some of them might have even been even more basic than this. Like they might have just been like a bicubic filter or something like that. But FSR1 is pretty good overall. Well, it's obviously compared to DLSS and like DLSS 2 and FSR 2, it doesn't look nearly as good as those. But by itself, compared to like the older upscalers that are using bicubic filters, or even bilinear filters, which are even worse, this is not that bad, because the Langzos filter is actually pretty good at sharpening the image overall. And that might be where the fidelity, CAS, contrast, adaptive sharpening, it might use some variant of this. Because it's not doing the upscaling, but it might use this just for sharpening. So, like Xbox Series and PS5 use this. It's readily available. Like Xbox, I guess what I should say, we're not talking about PS5 because I don't really have the full details on PS5, but I know the Xbox GDK, so the game development kit, has FSR1 from day zero. So it's literally built in to the game development kit. So you could turn it, meaning you could easily turn FSR1 on in pretty much every Xbox game, provided that the developer is actually using the full feature set within that development kit. So cross-platform codebase, It also can be utilized. It's cross-platform, so you can use it with the PC. Obviously, there's games that had FSR one, and consoles have it as well. And it's also in mobile gaming, so FSR one can be used in mobile games. Just throwing that out there. Genshin Impact uses FSR. Like it has FSR as an option for the anti-aliasing. Just fun fact for those that didn't know, because I know Genshin Impact is a very popular game. There's a lot of people that play that game on mobile devices, and it features FSR. So I guess the idea with spatial upscaling is the rastered output is undersampled for upscaling. So you can take something that's 720p and you're trying to make a 1080p image out of it. So you're basically undersampling, right? Because you have less data that you're starting with, and your output frame that will end up showing up on the monitor is obtained from less input data. So the problem with that is that it creates a lot of potential challenges in terms of, or I guess defects, if you will, in terms of the image. So like curves and corners oftentimes have aliasing or artifacting or step artifacts on straight lines due to a limited view, because when you scale it up, like you might not have enough of these individual pixels to sample, so you might lose some data here, right? And it might end up being this weird pattern where the lamppost might zigzag in and out of the screen as you pan the camera around or as you move past it, and your field of view starts changing, so it might actually get lost. Like the pixels, there's just not enough of them there. So that's sort of something that's known as temporal instability. When you're moving around, you're panning the camera around. You don't have to do it really fast, because if you're panning the camera around really fast, you might not actually notice these problems. It's when you pan the camera around slow. So think about like in-game cutscenes in a story-based game where the camera moves around real slow, like it's doing a slow shot panning around a room where a bunch of characters are talking or something. That slow movement, it might not look that smooth at the upscale resolution, or you might have weird things where certain things are either vanishing because they're not there, because when you upscale the image, there weren't enough source pixels to maintain the details in the differences in the color. So if there were some pixels that were supposed to be different shades of brown or like black for like a line or something, if there just weren't enough of them, you blow that up to 4K or something, and now it's like the color data's lost. So the wall might just kind of obscure that image or that sort of detail completely, because it's supposed to be like a blue wall or something, and then like the black line that was supposed to define some kind of thing on the wall, whatever, that might be completely missing in the upscale image. So those are sort of the problems with FSR1 in terms of what it lacked, and where it got a lot of its criticism from channels that would do a lot of analysis of pixels, most notably Digital Foundry. They kind of brought a lot of the limitations of FSR1 to the forefront. They did the exact same thing with DLSS when it was new too. But I think ultimately that's what kind of drives these technologies to improve over time. When you point out the weaknesses inherent with them, like, well, how do we improve them, make them better? So temporal instability was one of them. Thin objects flickering or vanishing. Slow movement, not looking that smooth in certain scenes with slow camera movement. Those are kind of the weaknesses of FSR1. So now we need to talk about FSR2, because FSR2 improved FSR1 in a lot of ways. So FSR2 was what a lot of people refer to as temporal upscaling. Now, the other thing too to note is that none of this has been relying on any kind of deep learning or machine learning, although with FSR2, they do use a form of machine learning, but they don't use it in real time on the GPU. the machine learning was used internally to kind of train the algorithm to figure out what is the optimal way to apply these post-processing effects when you're doing upscaling to minimize these negative effects that were seen with FSR1. And then once that algorithm was optimized through machine learning, that was what was then put in the driver stack for FSR2 to basically do a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. So the nice thing about this is it is open source, as you can imagine. It's easy to integrate into any game or potentially any application that uses kind of frame upscaling technology or has those sort of requirements. So it also supports multiple quality modes. So you can do things like dynamic resolution scaling. That was something that you couldn't really do with spatial-based upscaling because you were taking a fixed input image and you're basically blowing it up to a larger size and trying to minimize or prevent details from being lost in that output image. That was what FSR1 did. But FSR2 improved upon that because it allows for dynamic resolution scaling. A lot of people don't like dynamic resolution scaling. I know when Starfield launched, the actual presets that Starfield uses leverage dynamic resolution scaling. And a lot of people didn't like that because they thought, well, hey, it's kind of like they're cheating to achieve these frame rate targets for these presets because they're relying on dynamic resolution to do that. And the way that they leverage dynamic resolution is through the FSR development kit. So that is the reason why, if you guys remember, if anybody here even watched a lot of those videos, or at least some of the videos that I did on Starfield a few weeks ago, I talk about, in some of those videos, I specifically mentioned that the reason why I tested the presets as they were, I didn't turn off dynamic resolution, I didn't turn off FSR2, although I did do it in most of the later videos, but I still wanted to show the preset results because that is the way the game was intended to be played. Like, quite frankly, they made the game to leverage FSR2's dynamic resolution capability and the temporal upscaling. That's kind of what Todd Howard wanted them to do. And everybody complaining, saying, oh, it's not native, it's not native. Well, I mean, it's kind of the way that the game was meant to be played. Just to use a quote from NVIDIA's marketing. So, now you could turn it off, but clearly the game is very hard to run for whatever reason without using the dynamic resolution or the temporal upscaler. So, FSR2 is a temporal upscaler, so when you think about that, it means that unlike spatial upscaling, it needs the information on camera jitter, and it needs the information for the depth buffer to determine the vector data. And when I say vector data, I'm talking about the movement of an object on the screen as you think of like a ball that's moving on the screen and then it like bounces and then goes off toward a wall. That movement, there is a vector associated with the direction that ball is moving. Is it moving toward the screen? Or is it moving away from the screen? Is the ball going to get smaller as it moves away from the screen? Is it going to get larger as it approaches the viewport of the gamer playing the game? Like, what is the motion vector associated with that? So this is something that FSR2 takes into account because it actually leverages the depth buffer to figure out the motion vector data so that it can use that info to eliminate or at least drastically minimize the artifacts and the negative effects that were seen with FSR1. So that's kind of what it does to improve the overall upscaled image. And by and large, it's significantly better than FSR1. I tested Starfield extensively with FSR2, and I would turn it off. And In general, if you're using temporal upscaling to go from one resolution up to the very next resolution, it works really well. Now, if you're going from a much lower input resolution and you're going to a much higher target resolution, so for example, if you're going from 1080p all the way up to 4K, the effect is going to not be as good, or the result is not going to be that good, because you're not working with enough pixels to generate a good 4K image. Interestingly enough, this is a side note, if you're doing image generation using an LLM, it's the same sort of behavior. What they have found is if you're trying to generate an image, if you make the target resolution for the image you want to create from the AI, if you make the resolution very, very high, like a 4K image, or even 1080 is considered too big for an AI to generate something meaningful, at least today. If you give it a really large canvas, it tends to not create anything useful because there's just too much, I guess, screen space for it to work with. So it's kind of the opposite of, well, it's not the opposite. It's similar to with upscaling. So if I take 1080p and I 1080p upscale to 4K, the final image is going to be it's going to have a lot more artifacts. It's going to look a lot worse and not as clear or sharp compared to if I took a 1440p image and I upscale that to 4K, because that one tends to yield a very good result. And that is how they developed these presets. So FSR2 presets are basically, like, if we take 4K as if we assume 4K native, then if you're talking about quality preset is typically 1440p upscaled to 4K. Then there's balanced, which I believe it's either 1080p or it might be some intermediate one, like, well, I don't know. I think it's 1080p and upscales that to 4K. And then there is performance, which I think is like 720p to 4K. So in general, like I said, if the higher your starting resolution, or the closer, let's put it this way, the closer your starting resolution is to your final resolution, the better the result will be. The further apart it is, so like if we take the extreme case here, like 720p all the way to 4K, the result's not going to be very good. Hence why they have these names, because quality is harder to run because you're effectively running the game at like 1440p, but it's not going to run exactly the same as native 1440p. This is the thing that I think a lot of people don't fully understand about upscaling, especially this temporal upscaling. When you upscale from 1440p to 4K, so you're using FSR2 quality or DLSS2 quality, a lot of people think, oh, I'm basically running the game at 1440p. Now, depending on the game, you could get very close to native 1440p frame rates. But the reality is it's not going to be the same. It'll usually be slightly worse than native 1440p because there is additional resources being used by the GPU to do the upscaling procedure, to do the Lanczos functioning, to do the temporal upscaling, to calculate the depth buffers, to track the motion vector data. All of those sort of things require processing power on the GPU's end, and to some extent the CPU as well. And that is the reason why your frame rate and your latency for 4K quality FSR2 is not going to perform exactly the same as 1440p native. So just wanted to mention that because I think a lot of people, there's a misconception there where it's like, oh well, if I use quality 4K on FSR, that basically means I'm running the game at 1440p. Sort of, but that's not the full picture. So there's a lot in there, I guess. We don't need to spend too much more time on FSR2. Just know that it's temporal based, and a lot of the functions that exist within FSR2 carry over to FSR3. So that could be per pixel sample contribution. That could be adding the motion vector data, that sort of thing. It's all in there. So there's there's actually a lot to cover on just FSR2 itself. But what's interesting about it is it's something that was developed without having to use dedicated hardware. That's what I find kind of interesting about it, because it's a pretty challenging problem to solve, and it didn't really take too long for them to develop FSR2. Okay, so now we can talk about FSR3. So FSR3, I mean, I probably need to delete some of this stuff in the middle. So that leads us to FSR3. So with the way the render pipeline is, so if we use native as an example here. Yeah, you know what? I'm probably going to have to delete this stuff because this is just in the way. Yeah, because what I want to do, I might want to make this thing longer. So I'm going to need more space. Okay. Let's see. Let's just draw like this. And so what we're going to talk about now is we're going to compare FSR3 with native. Because FSR3 is basically, it leverages all the technology that was in FSR2, but it adds the ability to generate the frames. And I think that's, so it's kind of like DLSS 3 in that regard. So if we talk about the native render pipeline, so this is basically the finish. It goes from start to finish. So the first part of this, you have the main render workload. So this is the part where it's doing the computation with it's doing the compute, it's doing the geometry, the tessellation might be in there, etc. Basically anything that's not a post-processing effect. So it's not going to be doing ambient occlusion, it's not going to be doing like HDAO or HBAO. Those are all post-processing effects. So for native rendering without upscaling, this is the process. So, oh great. Native rendering. Okay, we'll just say no upscaling. That's implied. So in this area here, you have post-processing effects. So any sort of post-processing, like occlusion, maps, ray tracing also, I believe, is considered a post-processing effect for Radeon. I'm pretty sure that's a correct statement, although I'm not 100% sure where ray tracing is, like where that step takes place. And then you have UI. So the user interface is basically its own overlay on top of all the work that was done for the background, the foreground, the characters, all that stuff. The UI literally gets rendered separately in terms of the render pipeline. And then you have the final render step, where it basically composites the frame with all of this data. So it has the main render, all the calculations, then it adds the post-processing stuff second, then it adds the UI third, and then it renders it. So actually, instead of saying final render, what I should say is right here after UI, after the UI, it presents the frame. It presents the frame to the display driver. So in this case, it'll go to the monitor. So it's going to either go out DisplayPort or DisplayPort alt mode if it's on a USB-C, or to HDMI. So that's present. And then this is the next frame. Or I'll just say main render again. 2, like the next step, the next frame. So this is meaning this is 1 frame. Okay, that's 1 frame. Let's make that blue. All right. Now, how does it work when we add FSR 2? So FSR 2 is basically, it's basically the same thing, except, so what I should do here to make this faster, I should just copy this, copy that, paste that down here. Or actually, well, no, we'll do this here. So FSR 2 is essentially the same exact thing, except there is a step in here within the, like right after the main render, right in here, there is some upscaling that happens. The upscale step happens right here, before the post-processing effects. So this is upscale. We'll just keep it, well, let's just do it like this. The upscale. Like Super Smash Bros. With that up smash. Okay, so that's gonna go there. So the upscale happens there as part of the render workload. Now, the thing is, this actually forces the post-process to move out in terms of the amount of time it takes. However, because you're upscaling, some of the amount of time that is taken to do this main render workload is actually reduced. It actually takes less time to do this. So what that means is that right here, this actually moves a little bit this way. Let's just put it like that. Main, we'll just do that. See, so that amount of time that is saved there, that means that it's actually faster. It actually takes less time to render the image or to render the frame when upscaling. And that makes sense because that is the reason why you get a higher frame rate when you're doing upscaling. Because the frames are higher because they're being displayed on the screen in a shorter amount of time. So that's the difference between FSR2 and native rendering. So, and I guess what we'll say is this is using 2x upscaling. So this is effectively, like, this example would be like 720p upscaled to 1080p. So what does FSR3 look like? So FSR3, now we're just going to put this above the top one, the native one. Copy this, and then we're going to put this like here, because we don't need the preset stuff anymore. Okay, so what happens with FSR3 is now you have something called interpolation happening. Frame interpolation. So when you interpolate a frame, it means that you're trying to, think of it like you're trying to estimate a given final image based off of the data you have from the previous image. So you're wanting to create a frame based off of data from the previous frame. So you're interpolating the frame as opposed to just receiving the next frame or working on the next frame natively. So you're doing frame interpolation as opposed to frame workload render. So what that does is that adds another section here. So what we need to do is we're going to probably have to erase this. Well, we won't erase it. What I'll do is I'll just like move this out, because what ends up happening is this section here moves out. Let's just move it like about here. So you get increased latency when you do this. Why? Because you're having to spend time doing work on interpolating the frame. So there's delay here because you have to look at the frame and you have to determine hey, what is this synthetic frame, so to speak? What is it going to look like via the algorithm, right? Like how they're going to do the interpolation. So this right here, I'll just put it right here. This is upscale. Well, no, this is interpolation. Interpolation. Frame interpolate. Well, I'll just say interpolate. That's happening right here. So you can see that means that the amount of time it takes to complete the work is going up slightly. Because now our present is here instead of where it was. See? So that means FSR3 technically has slightly more latency, or takes slightly more time to render the frame to the output than native rendering. So FSR2 reduced the time it took to render the frame, hence your frame rate went up. FSR3 kind of cancels out that benefit that FSR2 had in terms of the latency, but because you're creating these frames, you're not really going to notice that, if that makes sense, because there are so many more frames being presented. You basically get the you basically get a rendered frame followed by an interpolated frame followed by a rendered frame. So I guess the way I should express this here in terms of this drawing is I should say you get the interpolated frame. So right here you get a present frame as well. Okay? So even though it looks like it's slightly worse in terms of the amount of time, because you're getting more frames than you were previously, it's actually no detriment in terms of latency, because you're just creating synthetic frames, so to speak, or interpolated frames, in addition to the physical frames that are being presented. Because you're still seeing that either that native frame or that FSR3 frame, but then you're also seeing a synthetic frame presented as well, back to back. So any kind of delay there incurred by interpolating that frame doesn't really, it's not really something that you'll notice when you're using FSR3 with frame generation, because the frame rate goes so high because there's so many of them. So I guess I should label this for those that are wondering. This is FSR3 using 2x upscaling and frame interpolation. Can't really fit it there, but you guys get the idea. Okay, so that's basically FSR3. And the thing about this is available in an SDK. Just like how FSR2 was available as an SDK. So if a developer wants to do frame interpolation within their game, they have access to that with FSR3. So this is potentially a game changer, because we were talking about the history of how the migration from 720p to 1080p took a number of years, but it was something that was achieved through newer hardware. The transition from 1080p to 4K obviously is taking a lot longer. Why? Well, because 8.3 million pixels is a lot more than 2 million pixels. 2 million pixels is twice as many as 1 million pixels. So 1080p is twice 720p. So that transition took a number of years for hardware to get powerful enough and cost effective enough for the average person that wanted to game at 1080p to be able to do it. That problem was solved around 2014. So about 9 years ago. So here we are, almost a decade later, and we're still not really, by and large, we're still not able to do 4K native without compromising on graphical settings, or spending an enormous amount of money on hardware. So like I said earlier, it needs to be cost effective so that the vast majority of people using the game and the resolution, in this case 4K, in order for them to be able to achieve that, it has to be a cost-effective solution. And unfortunately, it still isn't that way. So that is the reason why there has been a demand for upscaling technology to kind of be used as some people like to say that it's a crutch, like we're using upscaling as a way to kind of sidestep the challenge of 4K. Because realistically, like, upscaling doesn't really make sense for 1080p. Like, you shouldn't need to leverage FSR, let alone DLSS, for 1080p. Like, if you're having to do that, then clearly you're on hardware that's very old, and that hardware probably doesn't have access to these technologies to begin with. So you don't get frame generation from NVIDIA unless you have a 40 series card. And pretty much every single 40 series card, all the way down to the 4060, can handle 1080p without the need for upscaling. Maybe for the 4060 there are some exceptions for certain games. I'm looking at The Last of Us Part 1 and maybe Jedi Survivor. Those games might actually need upscaling at 1080p for a 4060. But by and large, most modern games run fine on a 4060 or an RX 7600 at 1080p resolution. So I still consider 1080p not really the use case for someone who would need to leverage this sort of technology. But frame generation by itself is very interesting because you can technically turn on frame interpolation without the need to do the temporal upscaling, which I think that's pretty interesting. Like, I was very surprised to see that that was a thing that you could do back when DLSS 3 came out. Like, you could literally just run the game at native and just turn on frame generation. So that's really cool. What's a 40cc? Never heard of it? Oh, yeah. It's just one of those things that just kind of exists, but no one really knows about it, you know? So that was FSR 3. 4060 equals... Yeah, okay. Yeah, leave it to Matt to always remind everybody what the equivalent Intel Arc GPU's performance is. It's like a translator. It's like we've got a translator in the chat. You can translate anything into Intel Arc terminology. Can you explain the problems people are running into with FSR 3 and fluid motion frame with VRR VSync? Oh, okay. So that's not really a problem, actually. That's just a misunderstanding of how the technology works. So let me see. What do I want to say on that? Because I do have something that I can say on that. So, I wonder how much of this I want to delete, if anything, because I think this is actually pretty useful. So, fluid motion frames is kind of something a little bit different. It's the underlying technology. So the fixed function to interpolate the frame, fluid motion frames are used to do that. But fluid motion frames can actually work separately from the FSR 3 SDK. Meaning you don't need FSR 3 to do fluid motion frames. So I just wanted to point that out. Because the reason... So, do you guys remember when Frank Azor got on stage when they were announcing the 7800 XT back at Gamescom? This was like, what, in August? Was when they did this? So he talked about how fluid motion frames would be the thing that allowed you to basically do frame generation on any game, regardless of whether the developer implemented FSR 3 support or not. So what he's talking about is being able to turn on that frame interpolation function without the FSR 3 software development kit enabled in the game itself. So it's kind of a hardware, well, it's a driver level feature, which is actually a game changer when you think about it, because it means that a developer doesn't need to even do anything with FSR 3, and you get the ability to generate these, I keep saying synthetic frames, but they are effectively synthetic frames because they're basically interpolated from the previous frame. So this is a separate feature. Technically, it's a separate feature. FSR 3 is a overall, like, it's a software development tool that a developer can choose to implement in their game because the SDK is available to them to use. It's open source. They can do whatever they want with it. But if they don't do it, then if you have an AMD card, you can leverage fluid motion frames. Now, the thing that I want to point out about fluid motion frames, everybody was saying that like you can do this with old graphics cards. Yes and no. Technically, you could, but realistically, you can't. Because the older graphics cards, so it's going to depend on the ability of the older graphics card, or I guess the GPU in general, to be able to do something called asynchronous compute. Asynchronous compute. This is a feature that has existed on AMD hardware for a long time. And only now have they finally unlocked the the secret code, if you will, that finally propels their GPU like way above where it was for many, many years in terms of like async compute was a thing that they had, but nobody cared. None of the games really leveraged it. DX11 didn't really benefit from async compute in any significant way. But DX12 changed that. DX12 actually leveraged async compute fairly well. So that's the reason why, if you guys look at the way AMD compared to NVIDIA in 10 years ago time frame, NVIDIA seemed a lot more efficient and a lot more performant because most of the games back then were DX11 games and they did not use asynchronous compute to function. Fast forward to today, and now a lot of these new games are DX12 based. And when you go and you look at the GTX 1080 Ti and how it does in these modern games like The Last of Us Part 1, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Hogwarts Legacy, just to name a few, it's basically getting destroyed by the newer NVIDIA cards because it just doesn't do async compute the way those cards do. NVIDIA only started supporting asynchronous compute in Maxwell. The GTX 900 series was the first generation from NVIDIA that had asynchronous capability. But the thing is, it had to be manually turned on. There was no way for the GPU to automatically start doing asynchronous compute, even though it was there in hardware. So basically, nobody ever did anything with it. Pascal kind of brought some of the ability to leverage it, but by and large, everyone ignored it. RTX 20 series rolls out. Asynchronous compute is starting to become more necessary because of DX12. So NVIDIA finally got on board and started doing things with asynchronous compute. But again, they're pushing the whole ray tracing narrative, and I don't really know what it does there. But RT might be more of like a post-processing effect. But anyway, going back to the fluid motion frames, the only GPUs that support fluid motion frames. So I guess we should go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and delete the FSR 1 and 2 stuff because I don't think we need this anymore. Whoops. That's not what I wanted to do. So we're going to delete this. In fact, I probably need to delete async compute. We'll just keep it for now. So, FSR 3 is an SDK, open source, potentially works on any GPU. But there's a huge asterisk next to that statement. Okay, next thing that we're going to talk about, FMF, or fluid motion frames. So AMD fluid motion frames. This is not an open source thing. This is something that if you're using the SDK for FSR3, this is the function in the AMD driver that will do the interpolation part of the frame generation. So this only works on RDNA 3 GPUs as of today. So if you have a GPU that is anything outside of RDNA 3, as far as I know, you don't get frame generation as of today. I don't know. Now, I have not tested the RDNA 2 GPUs with fluid motion frames, and I have not tested it with FSR 3. So I don't know how well it works in terms of the fluid motion frame. My guess is that if you load up Forspoken or Immortals of Avium, you do get FSR 3, but I don't know if or how well the frame generation aspect works, if that makes sense. You have to have an RDNA 3 GPU to get the frame generation. Now, let's talk about this confusion about variable refresh rate and VSync and all this other stuff, because that's where I think a lot of people are confused, because they don't actually understand how frame generation works. Now, the thing about this is the amount of time it takes to... Man, why is this, like... Why is my upscale word, like, messed up looking? Why does that look like that? Upscale. Why does it look like that? Whatever. It looks weird, but anyway. You tried using FSR 3 plus FrameGen and it didn't work like it did on the thing. Did FSR 3 work on the 6900 XT? Did you actually get frame generation as a toggle with the 6900 XT? Because fluid motion frames, I think, doesn't work on RDNA 2. As far as I know. Okay, hold on. You did get frame generation. Okay. So that means that they have... Okay. What that means is that the SDK enables it for that GPU. But keep that in mind. I don't think you get fluid motion frames for RDNA 3. I'm curious, though, since you tested the 6900 XT. In the Radeon settings, do you have the option to turn fluid motion frames on? Is that toggle actually visible to you? Because as far as I know, it should not be visible. It should only be visible to those with an RDNA 3 GPU. Okay, so let's answer the question about the variable refresh and why that's confusing everybody. So the people who are complaining about that, they don't actually understand how it works. So otherwise they wouldn't be complaining. So here's the thing about VSync. Well, now I realize I didn't talk about the... Man, I didn't talk about the actual steps. I kind of show them here, but I didn't talk about the optical flow analyzer, and I did not talk about the swap chain and the frame pacing. So we need to talk about two things. There is something called the FSR 3. So FSR 3 introduces some new things that FSR 2 did not have. Obviously, there's this asynchronous compute loop that runs, but then there are some other terminology that we need to talk about. So we need to list these very quickly because I can't believe I forgot about this stuff. So FSR 3 introduces something called the optical flow analyzer, and it also introduces the FSR 3 swap chain and frame pacing manager. So these two things are incredibly important in understanding how it actually works, because without these two things, you don't actually have anything with frame generation. You can't get fluid motion frames. Yeah, okay, so that's exactly what I thought. Okay, so FSR 3, and the reason why you don't have it right now is because the optical flow analyzer is developed only for RDNA 3 as of right now. So the optical flow it's a function in the FSR 3 toolkit that basically takes the depth buffer or the depth data, the motion vector. It basically uses the things that you typically associate with FSR 2 technology and it uses that to prevent the kind of like weird artifacts that you saw with FSR1 and FSR2, if that makes sense. So this thing is what creates the frame. This is the thing that generates the frame, or it plays a big role in generating the synthetic frame. Then it passes the frame to something called a swap chain. The swap chain will choose between the frame that the optical flow created or a native frame, a regular frame that did not come through frame generation. So, you have your generated frames and you have your non-generated, we'll call them your native. Well, I shouldn't say native because you could have upscaling turned on as well. So we'll just say real frame and generated frame. You have a real frame and a generated frame. And what the swap chain does, the swap chain decides, do I want to send a real frame to the monitor or do I want to send a generated frame to the monitor? So typically what it does is it sends a generated, then it sends a real, then a generated, then a real. So it's basically doing like this, back and forth, continuously. Interleaving between real frames and generated frames. That is what the swap chain does. And nobody ever talked about this. Like pretty much anybody on YouTube who made a video about FSR3 or fluid motion frames, I'm pretty sure they never ever mentioned this. They probably don't even know that this exists. So shame on them because they didn't actually do their research. So anyway, swap chain is the answer in terms of the frame pacing. Now that brings us to the VRR and the VSync. Why are these things, why do people tell you to turn VSync on or turn VRR off or turn VSync off or whatever, or like what's with the zigzag pattern? Okay, so now we're going to answer that question. But you have to understand the concept of the swap chain and what it does and where the generated frame comes from, because if you don't understand that, then what I'm about to say isn't going to make any sense. So, when this feature was developed, there needed to be a way to control the timing of the swap chain. How does the swap chain know how fast to present real frames and generated frames? How do you synchronize that? Because if you don't synchronize that, what are you going to get? You might get too many generated frames. You might get too few real frames. You might get too few generated frames. That could result in things like frame judder. That could result in latency or potentially maybe even some visual artifacts that weren't even there from the upscaling itself. So this is the reason why you needed to have a way to synchronize the frame pacing. So what VRR, well, not VRR, let's talk about VSync first. When you use the FSR3 swap chain, VSync enabled and disabled modes are the main differentiators in terms of the frame pacing. So the swap chain will literally use VSync, if VSync is enabled, to rely on the expected refresh rate. So basically what I'm saying is when you have FSR3 turned on and you have frame generation turned on, when VSync is enabled, the pacing of the frames relies on the expected refresh rate of the monitor, aka VSync, because that is the refresh rate of the monitor, and it will present the game frames as quickly as makes sense, meaning it will synchronize the effect of the real and the generated frames in line with the VSync. So ultimately what that means is the monitor, not the graphics card, the monitor will swap to the queued frame images in a consistent way behind the scenes. So a game using AMD's FSR 3 in this configuration will show a zigzag pattern on frame time present to present timing graphs. This is expected behavior. This is totally normal because this is how the swap chain is synchronizing the presenting of a synthetic frame and the presenting of a normal frame or a real frame. So it's normal behavior. That's why they say turn VSync on if you have a high refresh rate monitor, because it will prevent the tearing, and will also time, or it'll allow the swap chain to synchronize to the refresh rate of the monitor. So, I mean, there are more accurate ways to examine the frames other than looking at the zigzag pattern in something like Afterburner. But the thing is, if you do it that way, and this is ideal for those who have like 144 hertz or 240 hertz or 120 hertz monitor refresh rates. So the gameplay experience in that mode is actually recommended because you get more consistent timing when combined with the or like if you combine it with like a frame rate limiter or something like that. Define high refresh in this context. Okay. So yeah, that's what you would do. You would turn on VSync, and you would turn on frame generation, and that's basically what you would get. So now let's talk about what happens if you turn off VSync. If you turn off VSync, the algorithm actually becomes a lot more complicated. There are methods for when rendering is CPU limited versus GPU limited. Now, I actually tested the fluid motion frame earlier today with, what did I test it with? I tested it with a 7900 XT with a Threadripper 2950X. Now, the 2950X is pretty old, so it can bottleneck the GPU. And I went into Final Fantasy XIV, and I went into Limsa Lominsa, because that's where there's a ton of players running around and doing their crafting, and that is almost always a CPU-bound area. So I went into a CPU-limited area. I turned off VSync. I turned off the frame rate limit in the game, and I couldn't get the frame rate with frame generation, or not frame generation, with fluid motion frames, because remember, Final Fantasy XIV is not an FSR 3 game, so I can override that by turning on fluid motion frames. So I turned FMF on, and in Limsa Lominsa, because of the CPU bound scenario, I'm still at 55 FPS. So I turn it off, I'm still at 55 FPS. So it's kind of interesting, because if you're very CPU limited, it doesn't help, because it's like the synthetic frames, for whatever reason, don't actually do anything. Like, I couldn't see them actually being generated. It was really weird. But anyway, when VSync is disabled, basically what ends up happening is you'll just end up getting the most frames, but it might not be the best experience, just because the frames, they're not synchronized. So you just basically get a whole bunch of frames. So effectively, when you turn VSync off, you just get a really high frame rate, but it's not really the best experience, because the frame rate goes way high, but the problem is there's no frame pacing. So you just get a whole bunch of frames on the screen, and it kind of depends on the game. Like if the frame rate is super, super high, like if you're playing like Counter-Strike or something, then I guess it doesn't really matter. But if it's a game that's like a modern UE4 or UE5 game, you turn VSync off, then what ends up happening is you get more weight events used in the frame pacing. So what I mean by that is, what we need to do here is we need to show... Okay, how can I express this in this drawing? I guess what ends up happening is if you do not have VSync turned on, the renderer will actually add these stop gaps. It'll actually add like an amount of time right here. It adds this buffer, which are basically wait time, pacing wait. So it basically stalls it. It kind of like interrupts the pipeline, like don't send a frame, don't send a frame, don't send a frame to the monitor, because it's trying to keep the frames in order. It's trying to keep the swap chain from, you know, doing like one real frame and then like 2 generated frames, or 2 real frames and 1 generated frame, because then you could get weird like judder and weird tearing artifacts that probably wouldn't have been there otherwise. So it has to add these kind of like bump stops here, or speed bumps in the render pipeline on purpose to try to keep the frames synchronized together. Because remember, all of this stuff, like I just said a few minutes ago, asynchronous compute is how all this stuff is being done. They're basically creating this stuff. Think of this as having multiple pipelines of multiple work being done in parallel. Meaning this, even though I've only drawn one thing here, like I've shown you guys just literally like one render pipeline, there's literally multiple lines of these. So you can pretend that this one and this one are both FSR 3 render pipelines. So what we should do here is we should actually copy this 3 times, or at least 2 times, and delete the native one. So now we've got this, which might actually be like here or here. Let's say this one's like here. And now we have another one, which is, say, like over here somewhere. Or whatever. It's like, well, let's do this one further back. See, so what this means is you have to do a wait time to synchronize these. You have to kind of stall these out so that they all line up in order. Right? Like if I did frame 1, 2, 3 in parallel, they're all also creating synthetic frames. So now I've got literally 6 frames off of 3 pipelines. 3 render pipelines, I'm getting 6 frames. I'm literally doubling my frame rate, because if I had 3 pipelines, 1 frame per pipeline, that's 3 frames. But now I've got 6 frames because I've got 2 per pipeline. So how am I going to present that to the monitor in the correct order? You see what I'm saying? Because it's all done using asynchronous compute. Async means it's not synchronous. It means it's not in order. It's out of order. So how do you keep these things in order? Well, you have to use VSync. If you don't use VSync, then there has to be some alternative method to do that. And the way they do that is using something called pacing wait time, which is supposed to effectively, you know, like if this guy is the first one, then I'm going to have to put a wait time here for the next one, and maybe another one here for this one. See, I gotta slow these down, or not slow them down. I have to somehow find a way to synchronize them. Will they update FMF to work without VSync? It works without VSync. It's just, what did I just say? See, it sounds like you didn't understand what I just said. It already works. They're not going to change anything. That's, first of all, if you think that there's a problem with turning on VSync, then you don't actually understand how FSR3 is working. So people who are saying that it doesn't work because of the VSync having to be on, that's completely wrong, and that is the wrong way to understand how it works. I just explained what it does if VSync is off. That's what pacing weight is. Pacing weight comes into play when you have VSync turned off. If you turn on VSync, then you don't need pacing weight because everything syncs to VSync, and it will just render it alternatively, like, or interleaved between generated versus real. So when you think about it, it's actually quite fascinating how they managed to get this working, because none of this is using deep learning, and it's kind of a new way to think about how to do like frame rate analysis. Well, it's going to require a different way to do frame rate analysis, maybe, possibly, because the zigzag pattern is going to be a normal thing, yet you will still see your average frame rate reading at like 0.2 or something milliseconds, right? Even though you still see that zigzag pattern, because what it's doing is the frame analysis tool, it's when it's low, it's counting the real frame. Or when it's high, it's counting the generated frame, or maybe it's the other way around. I forget. But in any case, the zigzag pattern that you see in a frame analysis tool is basically showing you one of them. When it's high, it's either the generated or the real, and when it's low, it's the other one. So yeah, if in general, if you're using a 60 hertz monitor, then you'll turn VSync off. You won't use VSync with a 60 hertz monitor for frame generation. So unless your game is not able to do 60, unless your GPU is not able to do 60 FPS natively, then I guess you could do that. But make this a clip. I might actually make an actual video about this, but I don't know how I want to present the data. I kind of wanted to use this live stream as a way for me to first talk about this, to figure out an optimal way to put this into a separate video. But yeah, I guess I could turn this into a clip. Yeah, fluid motion frames, though, is a little bit different, because fluid motion frames doesn't do... It's not part of the FSR 3. Well, okay, no, I take that back. It is part of FSR 3, but it is something that can be done separately without FSR 3. Commentate over it? I don't know. VSync, well, maybe. We'll see. I'll have to figure out what I want to do. I'm definitely going to make videos about FSR 3, because, like, everybody, all the other YouTubers have put out videos just showing, you know, like, oh, this is how it runs in Immortals of Avium, or this is how it runs in Forspoken, or, you know, some arbitrary game with FMF turned on. You know, I could do that too. I mean, I'm probably going to do a video like that at some point, but I feel like it's more useful to the viewers if they understand how the underlying technology actually works, because I'm pretty sure no one else talked about this. Like, nobody talked about pacing weight, nobody talked about VSync versus VSync off, and why you need VSync. Because, see, the thing is, like, people are like, oh, why does VSync have to be on? Well, do you not know that it uses async compute? And do you not know how you have to synchronize frames in order in which they arrive? You can't just have frames just be constantly appearing at random intervals all the time. So, it's different this time? It's different this time? What does that mean? Okay, well that's FSR 3, and that's fluid motion frames. Fluid motion frames works surprisingly well. I mean, I've tested... So AMD literally said that... where is the thing? Hold on, let me share this real quick. So here is the driver. This is the preview driver that enables AMD fluid motion frames. And like people trying to understand FSR 3. Oh. So they claim that AMFM or FMF can be automatically enabled using HyperRX or using the global graphics toggle for these select titles. Now, I have quite a number of these. So I've got Borderlands 3, Far Cry 6, Hogwarts Legacy, Horizon Zero Dawn. I don't have those Resident Evils. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Starfield, and The Last of Us Part 1. I might actually have Hitman 3. I'm not 100% sure if I have that game. But those are the ones that I could test. I don't have Exodus Enhanced. I don't have... Well, do I have The Witcher 3? I don't even know if I have The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Like the latest one, whatever. So anyway, I've got most of these, or a good number of them, so I could test these specific ones. But I can tell you, I've already tested games that are not even on this list. So I've tested Final Fantasy XIV, and it works. I've tested, although it works kind of weird, because when you go into a CPU-bound scenario, you're not actually getting any synthetic frames. So, and then the other game that I tested was Lies of P. Lies of P also works amazingly well with this technology, or this feature. So, yeah, I'll probably test some of these, but it works in games that... What I'm saying is it works in games that aren't even on this list. So what this means is they tested these games. I'm sure that somebody within AMD validated that these games work, and it probably works in a lot of other games. They just never tested it. Is that CPU scenario like in player populated? Yeah, I'm talking about player populated areas. I'm talking about Limsa Lominsa. You go to Limsa... Anyone who has ever played Final Fantasy XIV knows exactly what I'm talking about when I say Limsa Lominsa by the Aetheryte. You go to the Aetheryte crystal, you're right in the middle, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're in a CPU-bound area, and the frame rate in that area, with or without FMF, is like 55 to 57 FPS. So just under 60 for a Threadripper 2950X. So I specifically chose to test with Threadripper because that is a Zen Plus architecture. It's not Zen 2. It was technically Zen 1. It's actually Zen Plus. So it's like a 2700X. So that would create a CPU-bound scenario. And yeah, Final Fantasy XIV likes Vcache. So so what I can do is I can test it with the 7950X3D and see what happens in that same exact scenario. So yeah, but this is kind of a game changer though, because when you think about this is something that works on every... Well, okay, no, hold on. No. I shouldn't say that, because right now, like Met just said several minutes ago, it only works... Today, this only works on RDNA 3. So in that regard, fluid motion frames is no different than DLSS 3. So with DLSS 3, it only works on 40 series GPUs. So anyone who has a mighty 3080, too bad. You don't get access to any of this. So, but AMD is kind of the same boat. Anybody who has the mighty 6800 XT or the 6900 XT, like Matt, too bad. You don't get fluid motion frames, at least not yet. So, that's kind of the way it's going to be. So in that sense, it kind of makes more sense to get a 7800 XT over a 6800 XT, or even a 69, or even a 6950 XT. So that's interesting. They said for now, though, hopefully they implement it for RDNA2 before next year. I don't know. I wouldn't count on that. if this comes out for RDNA 2, I'm going to guess that will be sometime in Q2 of next year at the earliest. So I don't. They kind of said next year, but I think next year is when this driver will be rolled. Like this feature will be rolled into the official driver stack, because this is a preview driver. See, it says preview driver. This is not the official driver. This is kind of like a beta driver, and this only works for 7000 series. So I have a feeling that when Frank Azor said, early next year, what he meant was, the way I understand it is, RDNA 3 will get this into the regular driver, the official driver, early next year. So that means RDNA 2 is going to have to wait even longer. So that's why I'm saying, like Q2, April, May, or June next year is the earliest that I would expect to see this feature roll out to RDNA 2. If not longer. So yeah, that's why I'm saying, if I was somebody looking at upgrading, and I was on a old 5700 XT or Vega 64 or the RX 580 or something like that, I would only really consider RDNA 3 at this point, like a 7800 XT or some RDNA 3 GPU, because you're pretty much guaranteed this without having to wait around for several months. So even if you could find a pretty decent deal on an RDNA 2 GPU, because I just think this feature is just way too important to ignore. You know what I mean? To not ignore. Like with DLSS 3, it's good for 40 series because it's basically the same thing. The only difference is 40 series, it's like DLSS 3 requires that the game developers add the feature to their game. If they don't opt to include DLSS 3 in their game, then the 40 series doesn't benefit from it in any way. See, so it's more of a gamble with the 40 series and DLSS 3. At least with this, if a developer chooses not to enable FSR 3 in their game because they don't want to waste time going back and working on that, then who cares? Just turn on the fluid motion frames and it's there. So I feel like that's kind of a game changer in a lot of ways, considering what we just talked about before, where did I delete all of it? Yeah, pretty much all that stuff that I talked about earlier with FSR is gone. But the history of why we need upscaling, it makes sense. Upscaling made sense, but now that we have frame generation, I really think frame generation is the real deal. Like, meaning, when I think about graphics and like where the market's going, where the game industry's going in the next 5 years, I really think that frame generation is going to be a thing that really takes off. And upscaling is probably going to become less important. Because if you can render the game at native resolution and then just turn on frame generation, that is better than any kind of temporal upscaling or even any sort of deep learning upscaling too. So it's very interesting. I'm just surprised it took this long to get to this point. Like, it literally took us like many, many console generations and many changes in terms of the target resolution from a game development standpoint to get to the point where, we finally need to reinvent the wheel. And props to NVIDIA, because they did DLSS 3 first, but it's really locked down, and there's a lot of caveats in order to deploy it. So, but now that this is out, and you just turn it on in the driver and it works on everything, or on every game pretty much. Wow. So that's a game changer. The thing is that for FSR 3 works on 20 or newer on NVIDIA, and that or newer on that. Okay, you know what? I tested 1080 and it didn't work. So, but they said that it wouldn't work, or they wouldn't expect it to work. So I tested Forspoken today. I said it earlier. I tested Forspoken with GTX 1080, and I could turn on FSR 3 native and all the upscaling presets, but I could not turn on frame generation. Frame generation, that sub menu was invisible. It was missing when I booted up the game with a GTX 1080. So I'll have to test it with the newer NVIDIA GPUs. But I was kind of disappointed that the old Pascal, man, everybody's really trying to kill off the 1080 and the 1080 Ti. Like, they're just trying to make those cards. NVIDIA wants those cards to go away. like Jensen Huang is literally like, you still have a 1080 Ti? Can you please like buy my new GPU that I've been trying to sell you for a long time now? Because it's like, we're not doing anything for 1080. Get rid of that thing. Like, get that out of my face. You know, like that. That's kind of where Nvidia's at when it comes to GTX 1080 and GTX 1080 Ti. Like, they don't want to see anything with the GTX brand at all. Like, if you say GTX in front of Jensen Huang, that's like saying a bad word. That's like trying to cuss him out in public. Like, no, you cannot say GTX. Like, that is politically incorrect. That is very wrong. It's RTX, not GTX. Get it right. The 10 series has bad floating. I just want to turn it on. I just want to turn frame generation on my GTX 1080. Why can't they let me do that? It's like, and first Nvidia wouldn't let me do it, and they completely locked me out of the DLSS stuff. Then AMD was supposed to save me. They were supposed to save my GTX 1080 and make it still relevant. It's like, you know, people were like, hey, it's not up to AMD to save your Nvidia card. But, you know, like I was hoping, you know, maybe the 1080 would get support. But no, it didn't get support. So I can't do, I can do native. I can't do any frame generation on 1080. I tested Arc. Did I test? Yeah, I tested Arc. There was no frame generation. Did you get frame generation with the Arc? Because I didn't get frame generation on that either. I tested A750, GTX 1080, and the RX 7900 XT. And only the 7900 XT had the frame generation. Which obviously, it's RDNA 3. It's like the best case scenario. It's AMD, and it's the newest generation hardware. So I need to go back and I need to test RDNA 2. I want to test RDNA 1, and I want to test, maybe some GCN, maybe Radeon 7. I don't know. That's a lot of GPUs, though, just to be disappointed when I figured out that it doesn't have the feature. It showed up when you tried using it. Oh, it showed up? I didn't even get it to show up. That's weird. See, I tested it with the A750 with the firmware update on the latest Intel driver, and I didn't see the toggle. But I had weird, like, I just had strange behavior because it might have been because I had two graphics cards installed in the PC. I had the Intel and I had the AMD GPU. And all I did was I closed out of the game. I moved the monitor cable over to the Intel GPU. Then when the monitors turned back on, then I proceeded to turn on the game again, and I didn't have the... Maybe I was running into a weird bug, so I don't know. But you said the game crashed, so I don't know. I was a little nervous about that firmware update, though, because I remember you were telling me about the firmware update, and your GPU was crashing, and so I was like, good thing we're doing this on the A750 and not the A770. But so my 770 is still on the old firmware. My A750 is on the new firmware. I wish they would list what the actual firmware was, because they didn't tell me what it was. It was like, hey, we're gonna update the firmware on the GPU. By the way, don't have anything running in the background while we're doing this. It could brick your entire GPU. Okay, so yeah, this is a pretty interesting discussion. The only other thing that I was going to talk about was the 14th generation, but I think we already kind of talked about that. The only really interesting one is the i7. And it's only marginally interesting if you like E-cores. They need to remove the firmware update from the driver. Yeah, that should not be in a driver install. That was bizarre. Because the few times that I've ever had to update a VBIOS, and it was officially through a vendor, it is never done that way. Like, that was bizarre. So, yeah. Okay, yeah, I could probably join for a little bit. I think we're pretty much done with this stream. That was basically a deep dive on FSR 3 and AFMF. Steve Noriega subscribed to the channel. Wow, he did it while we were live. You know, oftentimes, I don't know if Steve's in the chat or watching the stream, but oftentimes I think most of the people that subscribe while I'm live are actually subscribing by watching another video on the channel. Like, they're not actually watching the live stream. Because I mentioned the name and, like, nobody ever says anything, so it's like, I don't think they're watching, but oh well. When you looked at the 14th gen motherboards... Oh, do they not change anything? Well, the thing is, I don't expect them to change anything because it's the same chipset. See, the thing is, like, unless Intel changes the name of the chipset, it's exactly the same chipset. So, remember, last time they had Z690. No one is watching. You can get 5 M.2 slots. Well, you can't use the 5th one, though. Well, you can, but you know what happens when you do. Z690 was changed to Z790. So, see, like, this is a chipset change. However, this new one is literally Z790. I think they're calling it Z790 Max or something. So, this is, like, even less of an upgrade than this was. So, you know, like, I don't have high expectations for these motherboards. But who knows? Somebody might surprise me and make one that doesn't have that lame, like, lane sharing thing. Max X Pro? Well, no, what are those? Okay, well, I don't know. Maybe those are just the names from some motherboard manufacturer. Maybe they aren't even changing it. Because if ultimately, if it's still just Z790... it's the exact same chipset, just copy-pasted from the previous one. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, they're just gonna be the same rehash of stuff in terms of PCIe lane count. Because, see, the thing is, unless this changes, and it's not, you already know that your lane counts are gonna be exactly the same. So you're still gonna have, 16 lanes of Gen 4, 8 lanes of Gen 3, and what was the Gen 5 lane count? 16 lanes of Gen 5, 16 lanes of Gen 4, and 8 lanes of Gen 3. That's what you get with Z790. So all your Gen 5 lanes go to the graphics card, which is such a waste considering there are no Gen 5 GPUs outside that one GPU in China, which is basically as weak as a 3060, so it's pointless. Okay, and then outside of that, you get 16 lanes of Gen 4, which is, I mean, that's pretty good, I guess. And then you get 8 lanes of Gen 3. So it's like, okay, you know, that sounds very consumer and very mainstream. That doesn't sound very enthusiastic to me. But anyway, but that's what you get with Z790. And because it's still Z790, it's going to be the exact same 16.5, 16.4, 8.3. So, yeah, that's why, I don't know. I don't like Z790. I actually like Z690 more. Now, I know that Z690 boards were Not the best for memory overclocking, but they were actually better in terms of how they did the lanes. Like Z690 was 16 lanes of Gen 5, just like Z790, and then it was 8 lanes of Gen 4 and 16 lanes of Gen 3. So it basically flip-flopped the Gen 3 and the Gen 4. So what that means is you had less M.2 drives for Gen 4 because you only had 8 lanes. So you had 2 Gen 4 and you typically had 2 Gen 3 on Z690 for the vast majority of the motherboards. And then with Z790, because they upped the Gen 4, the only improvement was you got more. You pretty much have like 4 Gen 4 SSDs. And then the 5th one that a lot of people keep mentioning, that one steals Gen 5 lanes from your graphics card. So that's the reason why it's kind of a joke in my mind, because it's like, okay, it's like if you plug in a Gen... Okay, you don't even have to use a Gen 5 drive. You plug in any SSD in the top drive slot, the one right next to the CPU, the one that goes right above the GPU. As soon as you populate any drive in that slot, which is a Gen 5 slot, you just cut your GPU lanes down to X8. Like, instantly, you're down to X8 lanes. As soon as you use that Gen 5 slot for a drive. Doesn't even have to be a Gen 5 drive. You put something in there, you lose half your lanes. Just straight up, half your lanes gone right there. That is the reason why I don't like Z790. Anybody who basically bought this for a kind of like a prosumer workstation, they're pretty disappointed with it because of that. Unless they don't care about gaming. If they don't care about gaming, then yeah, they don't even realize that they lost half their GPU lanes because they don't really care. So, whatever. That's why I don't like Z790 though. But we'll talk about the motherboards as it gets closer to launch. We'll see. Like, if there's one that doesn't do that, like if there's one that literally just has Gen 4, no Gen 5 M.2, then that's probably going to be the one to get. It's going to be weird saying that. Get the one that doesn't have the Gen 5 M.2 slot, because that's the best one. But anyway. So that's probably going to be it for this stream. Hopefully now everybody understands, or at least people who watch the stream actually now understand how FSR 3 works. MSI and Gigabyte released the specs on the Max boards. Yeah, what did they say about them? Let's see, MicroStar International. Oh, let's see, MSI has one. MSI Z790 Ace Max. So, what's different about it? Okay, let's see what it's got. Well, what's different already is this is here. Okay, 3, you get this. You get that and that. That's nothing different from the previous one. Okay, 5M.2. This one steals... Oh, wait, no, it doesn't. No, that doesn't. That doesn't. That's Gen 4. So, M.2_1 is the boot drive. M.2_2 is a regular Gen 4. M.2_3 is a Gen 4. M.2_4. This is the one that you never use. Never use M.2_4. This one is the trick. This one is the scam. It literally has a scam right here. Wait a minute. Yeah, that's a scam. Where's the asterisk? Why is there no asterisk next to this? They literally tell you down here, but the thing is they don't have an asterisk. So people are going to forget to read this. M.2_5. See, I could tell as soon as I read this, as soon as I start reading this, I know it's a scam. I didn't even see the asterisk until, like, I was thinking there should be an asterisk. And sure enough, there's an asterisk. M.2_4 will be unavailable when installing in the PCIe 2 slot. So it shares with this, and this shares with this. So as soon as you plug something in here, because, oh, it's Gen 5, so, oh, what about this? This is a Crucial T700. This is the fastest SSD in the world. This is a Gen 5 SSD. It has read and write speeds of almost 13,000 megabytes per second. So this thing can push 13 gigabytes a second in terms of file transfer. So if I want to run my Gen 5 drive on this Max Z790, I got to plug it in here. Otherwise, if I plug it in any of these, I'm going to bottleneck it to 7 gigabytes a second because it can't exceed 7 gigabytes on Gen 4. This thing's capable of 13 gigabytes per second. So I would need to use this one. As soon as I plug this in, I can't use this up here, and I drop my GPU down to X8 lanes. There. So it's no different from the previous generation. M.2_5 from chipset supports the... Okay, whatever. So that's this the other one. So like I said before, this is literally no different from last generation. And realistically, you still only have four M.2 Gen 4 drives. Like, you could populate 4 drives in here without any sort of resource sharing. This one right here, 2_4, is a scam. In fact, I bet you that one is one of these top ones. Let me see. Manual. Where's the... Is it going to be in this one? Hold up. Wait a minute. Do they show the... Man, where's their block diagram? This is so annoying. Where's the... Okay, hold up. Right here. Okay, the scam one is actually way down here. That is a weird choice. So they put a Gen 5 all the way down here. Oh, I know why. They put it down here because it's right next to this one. And they have all these... they have these regenerators for the Gen 5, like running off the top one down to this one. So this is literally right next to it. Okay, so that's the one that you'll never use. So you can use the top one. The top one is a Gen 4 that goes straight to the CPU. So that's the boot drive. Then this one. So I guess the only thing that's better compared to the previous generation is in the previous generation, all the top ones that went to the CPU were the fake Gen 5 drive slot. So you couldn't even use those without, like, kneecapping your GPU. So it's like you had to put your boot drive, like, somewhere down here. So it was really dumb with Z790. So it is really, really dumb. Like, if you guys don't believe me, go watch the 13900K build video that I did. I literally explain, like, why not to use the top drive slot for this very reason. So anyway, so yeah, at least with the Max, they put the fake one down here at the bottom so you can ignore it. Whereas with the last generation, they put them all at the top. So pretty much, there's probably a lot of people on Z790 that have kneecapped their GPU and they have no idea. And all you gotta do is tell them to open up GPU Z and look at how many lanes it's actually using, and then they're just gonna have anxiety from that point forward. So that's fantastic. Where's their block diagram? I just want to see. I hope they included the block diagram. That's Okay, there it is. Okay. So look, see? Okay. This is the one. This is the top one. That one goes to the CPU. That's good. Here we go. Here's the fake one. Check it out. The fake one is connected to a MUX. See? So, in order for the GPU that goes in the top slot to get the full bandwidth, 8 plus 8, it has to go through the MUX for half of its lanes. And the thing is, the MUX has a priority. The MUX has a priority. The priority is second PCIe slot is first priority. So as soon as it detects anything in this slot, it will turn off these lanes to the GPU, and it will turn off the lanes to the fake M.2 slot. So this sort of thing creates a lot of issues, because if I want to run my Gen 5 drive at the full Gen 5 speed, I have to install it down here. So if this is my boot drive with Windows, and I have it down here, I'm already running my GPU at X8. I get that. But now, if I go and install a capture card or a expander card or anything in this second slot, now I can't get into Windows because I literally disabled my boot drive. That's fantastic. That's just wonderful. This is the reason why I'm saying Gen 5 on Z790, on Intel in general right now, is a meme. It's fake news. You can't actually do it without extreme compromises on the platform. See? So unfortunately, the Max doesn't solve the problem. It's still a problem with Z790 in general. And what's sad is Z690 never had this problem. And that's the reason why I recommended everybody to buy a Z690 motherboard instead, to avoid all of this confusion, because I could already tell in the back of my mind, like, there's going to be a ton of people that go build their PC, they're going to put this thing, whatever drive they go put it in the fastest one, the Gen 5. They kneecap their GPU. They don't really understand why their GPU is kneecapped. And then some of them might actually install something else, like a RAID card or whatever, in the second slot, and then they just can't get into Windows now. Inaccessible boot device. Like, what's going on? Why am I blue screening constantly? What's going on here? You know, like, what happened? I deleted my Windows by mistake somehow. So, you know, I can only imagine people who are not that computer literate would have terrible problems with this, and they just get so frustrated with it. So, anyway, moving on, just kind of look at the chipset. You get dual 2.5. You get dual. You get the data thing. What is this? So you get display out with a 10 gigabit USB-C. You get 3 more drives, so that's cool. So you have this one plus these 3, so you get 4 realistically, or 4 usable ones. Then what is this? SATA 7 will be unavailable when installing. So there's more sharing going on. Okay, so all right, and then you get this. So these 3 support RAID. These 2 do not support RAID because they're on an ASMedia 1061. That's a splitter that basically takes a PCIe 3.0 lane and turns it into a SATA lane, or for a 2-for-1. But you're basically going to bottleneck any SSD SATA drive that goes through here, so that's not recommended. This is where I would put the old, like, legacy spindle drives. I'd put them on these. Or if you had an optical drive, if you're still using an optical drive, I'd put the optical drive on one of these. And then this one, 20 gigabit. Okay, that's cool. But again, it's stupid front panel. It's stupid front panel. Why can't it be on the back? most cases don't even support 20 gigabit USB. So you have to have a brand new like case, expensive case too, to support 20 gigabit. Realistically, the wiring on a lot of these cases is so subpar that you're not going to get 20 gigabit. It's only going to end up being like a 10 gigabit. So this is kind of a waste. That should be on the back. And then that should be on the front. So, but they go and put the cheap 2.0 in the front. Okay, that's fine. That's pretty normal. So anyway, although it would have been nice to have some like front. What, these are all front? Where's all the rear? These are all front? Where's the rear USBs? This? So you get 3 10 gigs on the back. Oh, here they are. Okay, so these. They're using a GL3590 hub. Why? What's with all these USB hubs? See, the problem with this is how I can tell this is not a true like workstation, because first of all, I'm seeing a whole bunch of hubs. Why are we putting USB hubs in 2023 on a motherboard? And then we got like splitters for drives. I mean, that's fine, whatever. There's a splitter there. But all these hubs though, like this is just like making the bandwidth just cut in half over and over again. Like, why? This just tells me that there are not enough native USB ports on this chipset. So these are the reasons why people go to Threadripper and what used to be HEDT. It's to avoid resource sharing like this, to avoid all of this stupid stuff with the PCIe up here, and to avoid all these hubs because hubs are so unreliable. So, you know, like this is the sort of stuff you plug in like a Bluetooth headset with a USB dongle, and you wonder why like sometimes it'll disconnect and reconnect, and with the little Windows sound, the dun 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 dun. It's because of all this stuff. It's because of these hubs. Like, what's going on here? You have a shoddy power supply or whatever. Like, you have poor grounding. I mean, this stuff's gonna like disconnect all the time. Z790 refresh joke video. I mean, maybe, I guess. Realistically, the only thing that makes this new is two things. There are two things here that make this a max. One, it has Thunderbolt 4. For some reason, even though this is an Intel motherboard, for some reason, almost all of the Z790, the vast majority of the original Z790 didn't even include Thunderbolt for whatever reason. Even though you would think, okay, it's Thunderbolt, it's Intel, yet for some reason there's no Thunderbolt on the Intel motherboard. Like, what's going on? What's the story there? So they finally added that. That's good. So that's one thing that's new. The other thing that's new is Wi-Fi 7. Wi-Fi 7 replaces Wi-Fi 6E as the latest standard. So these two things are the reason why this is considered a max. It's because it's got Thunderbolt 4 and it's got Wi-Fi 7 and whatever the latest Bluetooth 5.4 is. You know, that's it. You get two new things. Everything else is the same. Same exact problems with PCIe. All these hubs everywhere to reduce your, like, you get bottleneck all your USB drives. That's fantastic. But that doesn't really matter at the end of the day. That's kind of a pet peeve, complaining about all these things, but it's still kind of lame that there's all this like hubs connected everywhere. And then you don't get 10 gigabit. You still get like 2.5. Like, why couldn't one of them been a 10 gig? Considering this is probably going to be like a $600, $700 motherboard. It doesn't have 10 gig. Why does it not have 10 gig if it's $700 or $600? Yeah, so like I said, it's a complete skip. Like, this is a straight up skip in my mind. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't do enough significant to even really do much in terms of like recommending it, to be honest. It's gonna be insanely expensive because it's the Ace. So I'm talking like at least $600 for this motherboard. And it doesn't even include 10 gigabit networking. So why is this thing here? So anyway, that's going to be a look at Z790 Max. you can tell I'm not impressed. Especially once you see the price of this motherboard. Do we even know what the price is? Probably not. But anyway, it's totally not worth it. It's totally not worth it. I feel like, man, Intel right now is kind of a weird choice because they're going chiplet with Meteor Lake, yet they're not doing chiplet on desktop until next year. So it's they'll be a lot more interesting next year. Like when they do the Arrow Lake launch, then I think Intel will have something to talk about. But until then, it's still just kind of there. It's just there. It's more of the same. The platform's not that great. It really makes me wish for them to have put out some kind of HEDT platform. And I don't know what the deal is with AMD, because AMD also is no better in the sense that AMD could release Threadripper, but they're choosing to just go with Threadripper Pro, which is so expensive that basically nobody can afford it. So yeah, it's kind of lame. But anyway, that's probably gonna be it for this stream. Hope you guys thought the FSR thing was good, because that was probably the highlight of the stream. So anyway, that's gonna be it for the stream. I don't know if I'm gonna do a stream this weekend. It's fantastic. Oh, I appreciate that. I don't know if I'm gonna do a weekend stream. If I do, it'll be testing a bunch of games with fluid motion frame technology on an RDNA 3 GPU. So, are you gonna join the VC? I could probably join for like a few minutes. So, all right. So with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and get on out of here. Hope you guys enjoy the content, and if you're new to the channel and you're watching this post the live session and you like sort of learning about these deep dive look at a lot of this technology that as it relates to not just gaming but also just kind of the use case of deep dives on technology related to graphics cards, CPUs, anything PC DIY, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It does help me out. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.